Hello there and welcome to Life Beyond Seen, where we sit quietly with the stories the world has not quite finished telling. There is something about the ocean at night that resists explanation. Not the danger of it exactly, but the scale of its silence. You can stand at the edge of a coastline and look out at all that dark water and understand, in a way you rarely do on land, that the sea keeps things. It holds them down in the cold and the pressure and the dark, and it does not always give them back. Most of the time, when a ship is lost, something surfaces eventually. A lifeboat, a piece of timber, a name painted on the side of a life ring bobbing somewhere in the current. The sea takes, but it usually leaves some kind of receipt. And then there are the other cases, the ones where the sea takes everything and leaves nothing at all. No wreckage, no bodies, no final signal, just a ship that was sailing one morning and was simply not there anymore by the afternoon. Tonight, we are going to spend some time with one of those cases, a ship called the Waratah, a liner that sailed out of the port of Durban on the morning of July 26, 1909, carrying 211 people and was never seen again. No confirmed wreck has ever been located. No confirmed body was ever recovered. No debris field was ever identified. She disappeared off the wild coast of South Africa, one of the most rugged and remote stretches of coastline in the southern hemisphere, and she's been missing for over 115 years. People sometimes call her Australia's Titanic. That comparison is not quite right, and we will get into why as the evening goes on, but there is something to it. The Titanic disappeared in April 1912. The Waratah disappeared in July 1909. She was gone 3 years before the Titanic ever sailed, and in some ways her story is stranger, because at least with the Titanic we know what happened. We know where she is. We have seen her on the seabed. With the Waratah we have none of that. We have a ship that was seen by another vessel on the morning of July 27th, sailing normally, and then was gone. We have an official inquiry that lasted weeks and could not fully explain it. We have a passenger who disembarked the day before departure because he said he had a bad feeling, and whose testimony has fascinated people ever since. And we have the wild coast still out there, still remote, still running under one of the most powerful ocean currents on Earth. Before we go any further, I want to pause and ask where you are right now. Maybe you're in bed with the light off, listening through headphones while the house is quiet. Maybe you are somewhere with a window open and the sound of rain outside, or a fan running or nothing at all. Maybe it is late and you are winding down, or maybe it is early and you are just waking up slowly. Whatever the hour is, whatever the temperature is where you are, I am glad you are here. This is the kind of story that suits the quiet hours. It is not a loud story, it is a slow one, and I think it deserves to be told carefully. If you enjoy what we do here on Life Beyond Seen, if you find these long, calm explorations of history and mystery and the stranger corners of the world to be something you look forward to, it would mean a great deal if you would leave a like on this video and consider subscribing if you have not already. It helps more than you might think, and it lets us keep doing exactly this. Now, let us go back to 1909. The Waratah was not a small ship. She was not some modest coastal vessel or a little cargo boat that might slip away without notice. She was a 9,339-ton passenger and cargo liner, built at the White Inch Yard on the River Clyde in Glasgow by a company called Barclay, Curl and Company. She was launched in September 1908, which means she was barely a year old when she vanished. 465 feet long, twin screws, triple expansion steam engines. She was designed to cruise at around 15 knots, which was a respectable service speed for a working liner of that era. She was operated by the Blue Anchor Line, a British shipping company that ran a route connecting the United Kingdom with South Africa and Australia. It was a long, demanding route, passing through some of the roughest seas in the world. The Waratah was their flagship. She was the newest and largest ship in their fleet, and she represented a significant investment and a certain amount of pride. She was built to carry both cabin-class passengers and large quantities of general cargo, which was the practical reality of long-haul shipping in that period. You needed both to make the economics work. Her interior was comfortable without being extravagant. She had dining saloons, passenger cabins, smoking rooms, the usual accommodations for a liner of her class and era. She was not the grandest ship on any ocean, but she was solid and capable and modern for her time. The Blue Anchor Line had reason to be pleased with her. But almost from the beginning there were questions. The Waratah completed her maiden voyage in late 1908, sailing from London down to Australia and back. And during that voyage, something was noticed. Not by everyone, and not in a way that immediately rang alarm bells, but noticed nonetheless. The ship rolled. Not in the way all ships roll, which is simply the nature of being at sea. She rolled in a way that some people found unsettling. She would lean to one side and then pause there for a moment, just a beat too long before slowly coming back upright. Experienced sailors and passengers who had spent time on ships before recognised that pause. It was not how a stable ship was supposed to behave. There were complaints made after the maiden voyage. Some passengers wrote to the company. Some crew members apparently expressed concern. The specific technical worry was about the ship's metacentric height, which is a measure of how well a ship can return to an upright position after being pushed to one side by wind or wave. We will go into that concept in more detail later in the evening, because it becomes quite important to understanding what may have happened. For now, the short version is this. A ship with a low metacentric height rolls slowly and may struggle to right herself. A ship with a high metacentric height rights herself, quickly, but rolls violently. Getting that balance right is essential, and some of the people who sailed on the Waratah during her maiden voyage were not sure she had gotten it right. The Blue Anchor Line received these concerns and, as far as the record shows, did not make significant changes. The ship was assessed as seaworthy. She departed on her second voyage in April 1909. One person who was not yet part of the story at this point was a man named Claude Sawyer. He would become, in many ways, the most discussed individual connected to the Waratah's disappearance. But his role in the story comes a little later. For now the ship was sailing again, carrying passengers and cargo, and the concerns raised after the maiden voyage had been noted and set aside. The route on this second voyage took the Waratah from London down to Australia, where she arrived and took on new passengers and cargo, and then began the return journey. She departed Sydney in late June 1909, heading first for Durban on the east coast of South Africa. She arrived in Durban on July 25, 1909. She was scheduled to depart the following morning, July 26th, continuing around the bottom of the continent to Cape Town, and then eventually back to England. 211 people were aboard when she left Durban. 92 passengers and 119 crew. They were heading for Cape Town, a voyage that should have taken a couple of days along the South African coast. She never arrived. The coastline she was sailing along is known as the Wild Coast. That name is not a marketing phrase, it is an accurate description. The Wild Coast runs along what is now the Eastern Cape province of South Africa, a stretch of shore characterised by steep cliffs, dense coastal bush, strong surf, and very few natural harbours. It is remote. In 1909 it was even more so. The population along that coast was sparse, the roads were poor, and the sea conditions were notorious. The Agulhas Current runs southwestward close to shore along this part of the coast, one of the strongest ocean currents in the world. When the current meets the heavy swells that roll in from the southwest, the sea can become genuinely unpredictable and violent. The Waratah was sailing through this environment in the middle of the southern hemisphere winter. July is not a gentle month on the Wild Coast. On July 27th, 1909, the day after she departed Durban, a cargo ship called the Clan MacIntyre was sailing in the same general area. The officers of the Clan MacIntyre spotted the Waratah, and the two ships exchanged visual signals, which was the normal practice between vessels of the era. The Clan MacIntyre's crew observed the Waratah and reported that she appeared to be sailing normally. No distress, no unusual behaviour. She was just a liner on a routine passage, going about her business on an ordinary winter morning off the South African coast. That is the last confirmed sighting of the SS Waratah. After that exchange with the Clan MacIntyre, she did not arrive in Cape Town. She did not send any distress signal that was ever received. She did not appear at any other port. She simply ceased to exist in the record of the world. 211 people, a 9,000-ton ship, gone between one morning and the next, somewhere along a coastline that people were actively watching, in waters that other ships were crossing. When the Waratah failed to arrive in Cape Town, the alarm was raised. Ships were sent to search. The Blue Anchor Line mobilised vessels. The search covered hundreds of miles of coastline and open sea. It went on for weeks, into August and then September of 1909, and they found nothing. Not a lifeboat, not a deck chair, not a piece of timber with the ship's name on it, not a body. The total absence of any physical trace was considered remarkable and deeply troubling, even at the time, by people who were used to the sea and understood how these things normally went. A ship that size, sinking in coastal waters, should leave something. That was the assumption then, and it remains a reasonable assumption now. The fact that nothing was found did not just deepen the grief of the families waiting for news. It deepened the mystery in a way that has never been resolved. In 1910, a formal Board of Trade inquiry was convened in London to examine the disappearance. Witnesses were called, experts gave testimony, Claude Sawyer told his story. The officers of the Clan MacIntyre described what they had seen. Naval architects debated the ship's stability. The inquiry produced a probable explanation, but it could not produce certainty. It could not say exactly what happened, or where, or at what hour. And it could not explain the silence that followed. The Blue Anchor Line did not survive the loss of the Waratah. The financial and reputational damage was too great. Within a year of the inquiry, they had sold their remaining vessels and ceased operations. The company that had built the Waratah as their flagship was gone almost as completely as the ship itself. What remains is the question. A question that has occupied researchers, maritime historians, and curious people for well over a century. What happened to the Waratah on that winter morning in 1909? Was she undone by a flaw in her design? Was she overwhelmed by a sea that no ship of that era could have survived? Was there something else entirely? And where is she now, if she's still out there somewhere on the seabed beneath the Agulhas current? To start working toward any kind of answer, we need to understand the ship herself much more clearly. Because the story of the Waratah's disappearance really begins not on July 26, 1909, but much earlier, in the shipyard on the Clyde, and in the observations made by the people who sailed on her very first voyage. The ship carried the seeds of her fate from the beginning, some have argued, others disagree. The truth, as usual, is somewhere in the middle of that argument, and it requires us to look carefully at what she was built to be and what she turned out to be in practice. The Blue Anchor Line was not a small or casual operation. By the early 1900s, they had been running ships between Britain, South Africa and Australia for several decades, and they had built a solid if modest reputation on those long southern routes. They were not one of the grand prestige lines, not White Star, not Cunard, but they were reliable, and they knew their trade. The Waratah was meant to change their standing a little. She was designed to be the best ship they had ever put to sea, their flagship, a vessel that would carry both paying passengers and profitable cargo, and do it well enough to attract the kind of custom that would push the company upward into a slightly more competitive tier of the business. She was built at White Inch on the Clyde by Barclay Curle and Company. The Clyde shipyards were among the finest in the world at that time, and Barclay Curle had a strong reputation. The Waratah was launched in September 1908. She measured 465 feet in length and displaced around 9,339 tons. She was driven by twin screws powered by triple expansion steam engines, which was the standard propulsion technology of the era, and she was designed to maintain a service speed of about 15 knots. That is not a racing speed, but it is a respectable and practical one for a working liner on a route that measured itself in weeks, not days. She was designed to do two things at once, and that dual purpose is worth thinking about for a moment. because it matters to what came later. On one hand, she had passenger accommodation, cabin-class berths for travellers making the long run between England, South Africa and Australia. On the other hand, she had substantial cargo capacity in her lower holds, designed to carry everything from general freight to bulk commodities. The combination of passengers and heavy cargo on a single vessel was not unusual for that era, but it required careful thinking about how the ship was loaded and how she sat in the water. The balance between passenger comfort, cargo capacity, and structural stability was not always easy to get right. And with the Waratah, it appears that getting it right may have been harder than anyone initially admitted. Her interior was fitted out to a reasonable standard for cabin-class travel. She was not a luxury liner. She was not trying to be. But she was comfortable, with a dining saloon, a smoking room, and the kind of modest but decent accommodation that a business traveller or a family making the long voyage between continents would have found acceptable. She had a crew of 119 to keep her running and to look after the 92 passengers she carried on her final voyage. The crew quarters were, as was typical for the time, considerably less comfortable than those of the paying passengers, but that was the way of things in 1908. The maiden voyage departed London in November 1908. The route took the Waratah south through the Atlantic, around the Cape of Good Hope, across the Indian Ocean, and on to Australia. It was a long passage, measured in weeks, and it was on this first voyage that the concerns began. The word that comes up again and again in accounts from that maiden voyage is rolling. The Waratah rolled. That in itself is not remarkable. All ships roll in heavy seas, and the southern oceans are not known for their gentleness. But the way she rolled, and the way she recovered from those rolls, was what caught the attention of people who knew what they were looking at. Some passengers described the ship listing to one side, and then hanging there for a moment, pausing in her lean before slowly coming back to upright. That pause is the part that would have made experienced sailors uneasy. A well-designed ship rolls and recovers with a certain rhythm, a relatively quick return to the vertical. A ship that hesitates, that lingers in the lean, is a ship that is not in complete command of her own balance. The technical concept at the centre of this concern is something called metacentric height, usually referred to simply as GM. This is a measure of a ship's initial stability, essentially how strongly she tends to return to an upright position after being displaced by a wave or a roll. A ship with a high GM is stiff and returns quickly to upright. She tends to roll sharply, but briefly. A ship with a low GM is tender. She rolls more slowly, lingers in the lean, and takes longer to recover. In extreme cases, a ship with insufficient GM can reach a point where she simply does not come back. She rolls past the angle at which her buoyancy can pull her upright, and she capsizes. The Waratah's GM was, from the very beginning, a subject of dispute. Some of the naval architects involved in her design and construction maintained that her stability figures were within acceptable limits. Others, including at least one engineer who sailed on the maiden voyage, were not so sure. It was reported that concerns were raised about her metacentric height after that first voyage, and that these concerns were communicated to the Blue Anchor Line. The company received the complaints, noted them, and the ship was assessed as seaworthy. She continued in service. This is not necessarily evidence of negligence, though it has sometimes been framed that way in hindsight. Ship stability in 1908 was not the precisely calculated science it is today. The tools available to naval architects and the regulations governing what constituted acceptable stability were considerably less rigorous than modern standards. A ship could be within the acceptable range by the standards of the time and still be, by the standards we would apply now, dangerously tender. The Waratah existed at a moment when the industry was still learning, sometimes through painful experience, how to define the line between a ship that rolls heavily and a ship that is genuinely unsafe. What made the maiden voyage observations harder to dismiss was the source of some of them. It was not only nervous passengers who noticed the rolling. Some of the crew, including at least one officer, reportedly expressed unease about how the ship handled in a seaway. An engineer aboard the maiden voyage was said to have discussed the metacentric height question with some concern. These were not people who were unfamiliar with ships. They were people who worked on them, who understood what normal ship behaviour looked and felt like, and who were saying that this ship did not quite feel right. The maiden voyage was completed without incident. The Waratah arrived in Australia, turned around, and made the return passage to England. She had not capsized. She had not come close to capsizing as far as anyone could tell. She had rolled heavily and made some people uncomfortable, but she had done her job and come home. And so the company's position, that the concerns were exaggerated or at least not serious enough to require action, was not entirely unreasonable. Ships that raised concerns and then sailed without incident were not uncommon. The sea has a way of making cautious people feel foolish, right up until the moment it does not. The Waratah departed on her second voyage in April 1909. This was the voyage that would take her to Australia and then, on the return leg, to the wild coast of South Africa. It is worth pausing here to think about what the Blue Anchor Line's decision to continue operating the Waratah without modification actually meant in practice. They were not, as far as we know, reckless people. They were a commercial shipping company operating in a competitive environment with a brand new flagship that had cost them a great deal of money. The pressure to keep her running, to make that investment pay, was real. The complaints from the maiden voyage were not nothing, but they were not, by the standards of the time, sufficient grounds to take a ship out of service. So she sailed. She carried passengers on that second voyage, as she had on the first. Among them, eventually, would be Claude Sawyer, who boarded in Australia for the passage back toward England. Sawyer is a figure who has attracted a great deal of attention in the history of the Waratah, partly because of the dramatic nature of his account and partly because of what happened to him specifically, which is that he got off the ship in Durban and did not get back on. He survived. Everyone else did not. That fact alone has given his story a weight that it might not otherwise carry, and it is worth being careful about how much meaning we assign to it. But Sawyer's story belongs to the next part of the Waratah's final voyage. Before we get there, it is worth sitting with what the ship herself represented at this point in her short life. She was 14 months old, she had completed one full round voyage, and was partway through her second. She was the best ship the Blue Anchor Line owned. She had been built with ambition and fitted out with care. She was also, if the accounts from the maiden voyage are to be believed, a ship that was not entirely at ease with herself in a heavy sea. A ship that rolled and paused and took her time coming back. A ship that made experienced sailors glance at each other. Whether that tendency was a fatal flaw or simply an inconvenient characteristic is something the 1910 inquiry would wrestle with at length. The naval architects called to give evidence did not agree with each other. Some maintained that the Waratah's stability, while perhaps on the lower end of comfortable, was not outside the bounds of what was considered acceptable for a vessel of her type and size. Others argued that the accounts from the maiden voyage, taken seriously, should have raised a red flag that warranted further investigation before the ship continued in service. The truth of it, the actual numbers, the actual behaviour of the hull in the actual sea conditions she encountered, is something we cannot fully reconstruct from the evidence that survives. What we can say is this: the Waratah was a ship about whom questions were asked from very early on. Those questions were not ignored exactly, but they were not acted upon in any decisive way. The ship continued to sail, and on her second voyage, heading back toward England via South Africa, she would encounter whatever it was that ended her. The design of a ship, the way she sits in the water, the way she responds to the push and pull of the sea, these things are not abstract. They are physical realities that play out in the relationship between a hull and the ocean beneath it. Every ship has a character in a sense, a way of moving, a set of tendencies that experienced sailors learn to read. The Waratah's character, as described by those who sailed on her maiden voyage, was one of a ship that was a little too slow to stand back up, a little too willing to lean. In calm water and moderate seas, that tendency might never matter. But the wild coast of South Africa in July is not calm water and moderate seas. It is the Agulhas current and winter swells, and the kind of weather that has been sinking ships in that part of the world for as long as ships have tried to sail through it. Whether the Waratah's rolling tendency was the direct cause of what happened to her, or whether it was a contributing factor alongside the conditions she encountered, or whether it played no role at all and something else entirely was responsible. That is the question that the inquiry could not answer, and that the absence of any wreck has prevented us from answering since. The ship's design is a thread that runs through every serious discussion of the Waratah's fate, but it is a thread that has never been pulled all the way through to a clear conclusion. What we know for certain is that the second voyage proceeded. The Waratah made it to Australia and then turned back toward England, carrying passengers and cargo and the accumulated weight of questions that nobody had yet thought to press hard enough. She was heading home, or part way home, by way of Durban. And in Durban, something happened that would make the Waratah's story stranger still, and that would give one man a kind of terrible distinction that he carried for the rest of his life. The maiden voyage of the Waratah departed London in November 1908. She was a new ship, and new ships attract attention. Passengers boarding her at Tilbury would have seen a vessel that looked the part, large, purposeful, freshly painted, carrying the quiet authority of something recently made. The Blue Anchor Line had reason to be proud of her. She was the biggest ship they had ever operated, and she was designed to make the long run down to Australia and back feel, if not luxurious, then at least solid and reliable. That was the promise she carried with her as she moved down the Thames and out into the open Atlantic. The voyage south was unremarkable in most respects. The Waratah called at various ports, made reasonable time, and arrived in Australia without any incident that would appear in the official record as a cause for concern. But the people aboard her noticed things. Not dramatic things. Not the kind of things that get written up in formal reports, but the quieter observations that passengers and crew make to each other when they are living on a ship for weeks at a time and paying attention to how she moves. What they noticed broadly was this: the Waratah rolled. That is not unusual for a ship. All ships roll in a seaway. What attracted comment was the way she rolled. She would lean into a wave and then, instead of springing back upright the way a well-balanced ship tends to do, she would pause. She would hesitate at the end of her roll, staying tilted for a moment longer than felt natural, before slowly righting herself. For passengers who had never been to sea before, this might have been merely uncomfortable. For those who had made ocean voyages before, or for the sailors who knew what a healthy roll felt like, it was something that prompted a second thought. The technical term that came up in later discussions, and that the 1910 inquiry would examine carefully, is metacentric height, usually referred to simply as GM. It is a measure of a ship's initial stability, specifically the distance between the ship's centre of gravity and a calculated point called the metacentre. When a ship is floating upright and then tilted by a wave, the metacentric height determines how strongly she's pulled back toward vertical. A ship with a high GM has strong initial stability. She snaps back quickly and rolls with energy. A ship with a low GM has weaker initial stability. She rolls more gently, more slowly, and in extreme cases may not recover from a large roll at all. The ideal is somewhere in between, and the calculation of GM is one of the fundamental concerns of naval architecture. What some of those aboard the Waratah on her maiden voyage were describing, without necessarily using that language, was a ship that behaved as though her GM was on the low side. The hesitation at the end of the roll, the slow recovery. These are the observable symptoms of a vessel that is not as eager to stand back up as she ought to be. One engineer, and this account appears in later testimony, though the exact source is difficult to pin down with complete certainty, reportedly expressed concern specifically about the ship's metacentric height during or shortly after the maiden voyage. Whether this concern was formally communicated to the Blue Anchor Line in writing, or whether it remained at the level of informal conversation among crew, is not entirely clear from the surviving record. What is clear is that some complaints did reach the Blue Anchor Line. The company received feedback from the maiden voyage that touched on the ship's rolling behaviour. The precise nature of their internal response is not something we can fully reconstruct, but the practical outcome is straightforward. The Waratah was not taken out of service, was not sent back to Barclay, Curl and Company for modification, and was not subjected to a formal stability investigation before her second voyage. She was assessed as seaworthy. The judgment was made by whoever made it, that the concerns raised were not sufficient to ground her. It is tempting, looking back, to read this as obvious negligence, but it is worth being honest about the difficulty of that judgment at the time. The Waratah had completed her maiden voyage without capsizing, without any dangerous incident, without any moment where the rolling had actually become a crisis. She had behaved oddly, in the opinion of some aboard her, but she had also arrived safely in Australia and safely returned. The line between a ship that is uncomfortable at sea and a ship that is genuinely unsafe is not always easy to draw, and in 1908 the standards and methods for assessing that line were less formalised than they would later become. The people who decided the Waratah should continue sailing were not necessarily wrong to do so based on what they knew and how they measured it. They were at worst insufficiently cautious. Whether that insufficiency was the thing that ultimately killed 211 people is one of the questions that has never been resolved. The Waratah departed on her second voyage in April 1909. She was heading back to Australia, and then she would return via South Africa. The route was the same as before, the ship was the same as before. The concerns, such as they were, had been noted and set aside. She carried passengers and cargo, as she was built to do, and she made her way south and east across the oceans she was designed to cross. It is worth thinking for a moment about what that second voyage would have felt like for the people aboard her during its earlier stages. The passengers who had not sailed on the maiden voyage would have had no particular reason for anxiety. They were on a new ship, a big ship, a ship operated by an established company. The crew, some of whom may have been on the maiden voyage, and some of whom may have been new, would have been getting used to her rhythms. Every ship is slightly different, and sailors learn a ship's character over time, how she responds in different sea states, where she likes to sit in the water, what her sounds mean. The Waratah's character, as we have already established, included that slow roll and that hesitating recovery. Whether the crew of the second voyage discussed this among themselves, whether they had any particular concern about it, is not something the historical record tells us clearly. What the record does tell us is that the Waratah arrived in Australia, completed her business there, and then prepared to depart for the return leg. She left Sydney in late June 1909, bound first for Durban on the east coast of South Africa. She was carrying approximately 6,500 tons of cargo, a detail that would become relevant in the later technical discussions about her stability, because the nature and distribution of that cargo affected how she sat in the water. Among the cargo were lead concentrates stowed in the lower holds, which would in theory have lowered her centre of gravity and improved her stability. Whether the loading was done in a way that actually achieved this effect, or whether the distribution was uneven in ways that created problems, is something the inquiry examined without reaching a firm conclusion. And among the passengers who boarded in Australia for the passage to Durban was Claude Sawyer. Sawyer was a businessman, not a sailor. He had booked passage on the Waratah for the leg from Australia back toward England, travelling via South Africa. He was, by the accounts that survive, an ordinary passenger in most respects, not someone with a maritime background, not someone whose opinion about a ship's stability would carry technical weight. What distinguished Sawyer, and what has made him one of the most discussed figures in the Waratah's history, was what he said happened to him during the voyage from Australia to Durban. He described having recurring nightmares, or visions depending on how you read his account. The language he used when he later testified at the 1910 inquiry was not always precise on this point, and the line between a very vivid dream and something he experienced while awake is not always clear in his testimony. What he described, repeatedly, was a figure, a man, or a figure resembling a man holding a sword. The sword was bloody. The figure appeared to him more than once during the voyage, and Sawyer interpreted these appearances as a warning specifically about the ship. He became convinced, through whatever combination of instinct and anxiety and these nocturnal visions, that the Waratah was not safe, and that he should not continue on her. When the Waratah arrived in Durban on July 25, 1909, Claude Sawyer disembarked. He refused to reboard. He sent a telegram to his wife telling her he had left the ship because he felt it was unsafe. He booked alternative passage and continued his journey home by other means. The Waratah departed Durban on July 26, 1909, without him. She had 211 people aboard, 92 passengers and 119 crew. She was heading for Cape Town, roughly 800 miles to the southwest along the South African coast. It was a route she had sailed before, or at least a route of the same type. The weather in that part of the world in late July is winter weather. Cold fronts, heavy swells, the Agulhas current running hard close to the coast. She did not arrive in Cape Town. Now, it is important to be careful about Claude Sawyer, because his story is the kind of story that is very easy to misread. The temptation is to treat his visions as evidence of something, as a premonition that was somehow real, or as proof that the ship's danger was perceptible even to a non-expert passenger. That reading makes for a more dramatic story, but it is not quite honest. The more grounded way to think about Sawyer is this. He was a man who was uncomfortable on the ship, who had noticed its rolling behaviour during the voyage, and who had worked himself into a state of genuine anxiety about it. The visions, whatever their nature, may have been the product of that anxiety rather than its cause. He was, in other words, possibly a man who was frightened for rational reasons and expressed that fear in an irrational form, or he was simply a man who had bad dreams and got lucky. The inquiry treated his testimony seriously, but did not suggest that his visions were anything other than the product of his own imagination. What the inquiry found interesting about Sawyer was not the visions themselves, but the fact that he had been sufficiently alarmed by the ship's behaviour to actually leave her, and that his alarm, whatever its source, turned out to be justified. The other passengers and crew who remained aboard the Waratah when she left Durban on July 26th did not share Sawyer's alarm, or at least did not act on it in the way he did. Captain Josiah Ilbery, who commanded the ship, was an experienced officer with many years of service with the Blue Anchor Line. He was not a man who would have sailed a ship he believed to be in danger of sinking. Whatever the Waratah's rolling tendencies, whatever the concerns raised on the maiden voyage, the captain of a ship is the person most responsible for assessing its safety in real time, and Ilbery clearly judged her fit to sail. The passengers who remained aboard had made a calculation, consciously or not, that the ship was safe enough. Most people do not leave a ship because it rolls. Most people assume that a ship built by a reputable yard and operated by an established company is fundamentally sound, and that assumption is, most of the time, correct. The Waratah cleared Durban harbour and moved out into the Indian Ocean, or more precisely into the waters between the Indian and Atlantic Oceans, that stretch of sea off the South African coast where the great currents run and the weather in winter can be severe. She was heading southwest, which meant she was heading into the Agulhas current and into whatever weather the season had arranged for that particular week of July. The coast she was sailing along, the Wild Coast as it is known, the stretch of rugged shoreline running through what is now the Eastern Cape, was not a forgiving piece of geography. There are few harbours along it, few places to shelter. The cliffs come down to the sea in many places, and the surf runs hard against them. It is not a coast that welcomes ships in trouble. The following day, July 27th, 1909, the cargo ship Clan MacIntyre reported seeing the Waratah near the mouth of the Bashi River. The officers of the Clan MacIntyre exchanged signals with her. She appeared by their account to be normal. She was making way. She was not in distress. She was simply a large passenger cargo liner proceeding along the coast as expected. The Clan MacIntyre continued on her own course. the Waratah continued on hers. That exchange of signals, that ordinary moment of two ships passing each other off a rugged coastline on a winter morning, is the last confirmed sighting of the SS Waratah. After that, the record goes quiet in a way that is almost impossible to fully absorb. A ship of more than 9,000 tons, carrying 211 people, simply ceased to exist as far as the observable world was concerned. She did not arrive in Cape Town. She sent no distress signal. She left no wreckage. She left nothing at all. And the question of what happened to her in the hours after the Clan MacIntyre last saw her heading southwest has been open ever since. The second voyage of the Waratah began in London in April 1909. She departed with passengers and cargo, made her way south and east, rounded the Cape, and eventually arrived in Australia, completing the same general route she'd been designed to serve. From Australia, she took on new passengers and cargo, and in late June 1909 she departed Sydney, bound for Durban on the South African east coast. This was the leg of the voyage on which Claude Sawyer was aboard. He had boarded in Australia, as many passengers did on that route, people travelling between the two British dominions that sat on opposite sides of the Indian Ocean, connected by commerce and empire and the long blue distance between them. The voyage from Australia to Durban takes a ship across a considerable stretch of open ocean. There is a lot of time at sea and a lot of time to notice how a ship moves. Sawyer noticed. Whatever his baseline of experience with ocean travel, and he was not a novice sailor, he found the Waratah's behaviour during this crossing to be wrong in a way he could not entirely articulate, but could not ignore. She rolled. She rolled in the way that passengers on the maiden voyage had described, heavily and with that pause before recovery that experienced people found unsettling. Not a quick, lively roll and snap back, but a slow lean to one side, a moment of hesitation, and then a reluctant return to something closer to upright. Whether this was worse on this particular voyage than it had been on the maiden voyage, or whether Sawyer was simply more attuned to it than previous passengers, is impossible to say now. What is clear is that by the time the Waratah reached Durban, Sawyer had made up his mind. But before we get to his departure, it is worth dwelling on the nightmares, or visions, or whatever we choose to call them, because they are the detail that has followed this story for more than a century, and they deserve to be looked at carefully rather than just accepted as atmosphere. Sawyer later testified at the official inquiry that during the voyage from Australia, he experienced recurring visions of a figure, a man, dressed in a kind of shroud or long garment holding a sword. The sword was bloody or dripping depending on which account you read. The figure appeared to him more than once. Sawyer found these visions deeply disturbing. He interpreted them as a warning. Now, what do we actually do with this? It is easy to reach for the word premonition and leave it there, which is what a lot of retellings of the Waratah story do. It makes the narrative tidier. But the honest position is that we do not know what Sawyer's visions were. They may have been vivid anxiety dreams produced by a man who was genuinely frightened by the ship's behaviour and whose sleeping mind translated that fear into something more dramatic. They may have been waking hallucinations produced by stress and poor sleep on a rolling ship. They may have been something he embellished slightly in retrospect, after the Waratah had already disappeared, and his decision to leave her had taken on a significance he could not have anticipated at the time. None of these explanations require anything supernatural, and the inquiry, which was a sober legal proceeding, treated his account of the visions with careful neutrality, noting them as part of his testimony without suggesting they were anything more than the product of his own state of mind. What the inquiry was more interested in was the practical side of Sawyer's decision, because whatever the visions meant or did not mean, the underlying concern they represented, that the ship was not safe, was a concern that had been raised before by other people in more technical language. Sawyer was not a naval architect. He could not calculate metacentric height or assess cargo distribution or evaluate the relationship between a ship's rolling period and the wave conditions she was likely to encounter. But he was a person who had spent several weeks on the Waratah, and had come away convinced that she was dangerous. And he acted on that conviction in a way that was by any measure unusual. Most people do not get off a ship in a foreign port and refuse to continue. It is an inconvenient thing to do, an expensive thing, a socially awkward thing. You have to find alternative passage, rearrange your plans, explain yourself to people. Sawyer did all of this without apparent hesitation. He disembarked at Durban on July 25, 1909. He sent a telegram to his wife. The telegram is sometimes quoted in accounts of the Waratah story, and while the exact wording varies between sources, the substance is consistent. He had left the Waratah because he felt she was unsafe, and he was making his way home by other means. It is a remarkably calm and practical communication for a man who had just walked off a ship because of a recurring nightmare about a figure with a bloody sword. Which perhaps tells us something about Sawyer, that whatever his interior experience had been during the voyage, he was capable of translating it into a rational decision and explaining that decision in rational terms. He did not write to his wife about the visions. He wrote about feeling the ship was unsafe. The visions were the form his fear took. The fear itself was about the ship. The Waratah departed Durban the following morning, July 26, 1909. She had 211 people aboard, 92 passengers, 119 crew. Captain Josiah Ilbery was in command. Ilbery was not a young or inexperienced officer. He had served the Blue Anchor Line for many years and was regarded as one of their most capable commanders. He had sailed these waters before, understood the Agulhas current, understood the winter weather patterns along the South African coast. He was not a man who would have been unaware of the concerns raised about the ship's stability on her maiden voyage. The maritime world of 1909 was not so large that a ship's reputation, good or bad, did not travel among the people who worked on and around ships. Whether Ilbery shared those concerns privately, or dismissed them, or had assessed the ship on his own terms and found her acceptable, we do not know. He left no record of his thinking on the matter, or if he did, it went with him. The passengers who remained aboard when the Waratah left Durban were a mixed group, as passengers on this route tended to be. Some were travelling between Australia and Britain, using the South African ports as intermediate stops. Some were travelling within the South African region. There were families aboard, businessmen, people making ordinary journeys for ordinary reasons, with no particular reason to think that the morning of July 26th, 1909 was different from any other departure morning. The ship was large and substantial. The Blue Anchor Line was an established company. Captain Ilbery was experienced. These were the kinds of reassurances that passengers carried with them, mostly without thinking about them, in the way that most of us carry the assumption that the things we depend on will continue to work. The Waratah moved out of Durban Harbour and turned southwest. Cape Town was roughly 800 miles away along the coast. The route would take her along the Wild Coast, that stretch of rugged shoreline that runs through what is now the Eastern Cape Province of South Africa. It is called the Wild Coast for a reason. The cliffs are steep and dark, falling straight to the sea in many places. The surf comes in hard and heavy. There are almost no natural harbours along most of its length, which means that for a ship in trouble along that coast the options are limited. You cannot simply pull in somewhere and wait for the weather to pass. You're either underway or you are in serious difficulty. The weather in that part of the world in late July is winter weather. The Southern Ocean, which lies to the south, generates large swells that travel north and northeast, arriving at the South African coast with considerable energy behind them. Cold fronts push up from the south, bringing strong winds and heavy seas. The Agulhas current runs close to the coast, flowing southwestward at speeds that can reach 4 or 5 knots, a significant force that any ship navigating the coast has to account for. When the current and the swell and the wind are all working against each other, which they can do in these waters, the sea state becomes something that even experienced mariners treat with respect. In 1909, ships navigated these conditions by experience and observation and weather reports passed by telegraph, without the satellite imagery and numerical weather forecasting that modern mariners have access to. You looked at the barometer, you read the sky. You listened to what other ships reported and you made your best judgment. Somewhere along that coast on July 27th or shortly thereafter, the Waratah encountered whatever she encountered. But before we get to the absence, to the silence that begins after the Clan MacIntyre's sighting, it is worth thinking about what the voyage from Durban would have looked like in its early hours. The ship leaving harbour, the coast of KwaZulu-Natal sliding past to the east, the sea conditions building or not building depending on what the weather was doing that particular week. The passengers going about the routines of shipboard life, meals, conversations, the particular boredom and comfort of being at sea with nowhere else to go. The crew working their watches, the engines running, the propellers turning, the hull pushing through the water at something close to her service speed of 15 knots. It would have looked, from the outside, like an ordinary passage. The Clan MacIntyre saw her the following morning, July 27th, near the Bashi River mouth, and reported that she appeared normal. This is important to sit with for a moment. The officers of the Clan MacIntyre were experienced mariners. They knew what a ship in distress looked like, and the Waratah did not look like that. She was making way, she was on course, she was not flying distress signals or behaving in any way that suggested trouble. The two ships exchanged signals. In 1909 this meant flag signals, or Morse lamp, not radio, since wireless telegraphy was still far from universal on merchant ships, and then continued on their respective courses. It was a brief, unremarkable encounter between two ships going different directions on the same stretch of coast. The Clan MacIntyre's officers later testified to this at the inquiry. Their account is precise and consistent. The Waratah was seen, she appeared normal, and then she was gone from view as the two ships drew apart. There is no drama in the Clan MacIntyre's testimony, no sense that anyone on her bridge felt anything unusual about the encounter. It was simply two ships passing, the way ships pass each other thousands of times a day on the world's sea lanes, without incident or consequence, except that for the Waratah, that passing was the last moment she existed, in any confirmed sense, in the world of the living. After the Clan MacIntyre's officers last saw her, the Waratah enters a silence from which she has never emerged. She did not arrive in Cape Town. She sent no wireless distress call, though it bears noting that wireless equipment was not standard on all merchant ships in 1909, and it is not entirely clear what communications equipment the Waratah carried. She left no wreckage on the coast. She left no lifeboats drifting at sea. She left nothing that could be definitively identified as having come from her. A Union Castle liner called the Guelph also reported seeing a ship that may have been the Waratah around the same time and in roughly the same area, though this account is considered less certain than the Clan MacIntyre's. If the Guelph sighting was accurate, it would place the Waratah a little further along the coast, a little closer to Cape Town, a little further into the morning of July 27th. But the Guelph's officers were less certain of the identification, and the inquiry treated this sighting with appropriate caution. The Clan MacIntyre's account remains the solid last confirmed data point. What happened in the hours after that last sighting is the question that the inquiry spent weeks trying to answer, that researchers have spent decades trying to answer, that the families of the 211 people aboard spent the rest of their lives trying to answer. The Waratah was somewhere off the wild coast of South Africa on the morning of July 27th, 1909. She was heading southwest. She appeared to be fine, and then she was not there anymore. Not in Cape Town, not washed up on the coast, not floating in pieces on the surface of the sea, just gone, in the way that things in stories go gone, except that this was not a story. It was a ship, and a crew, and passengers, and a captain who had sailed those waters many times before. The alarm, when it came gradually rather than all at once. Ships in 1909 did not have the constant position reporting that modern vessels carry. A ship was expected to arrive, and if she did not arrive on the expected date, there was initially a period of uncertainty rather than immediate crisis. She could have been delayed by weather. She could have put in somewhere along the coast for reasons that had not yet been communicated. The telegraph lines that connected the South African ports could carry news of a ship's arrival or non-arrival. but they could not tell you where a ship was if the ship itself was not reporting. The waiting in those first days after the Waratah failed to appear in Cape Town must have been a particular kind of dread, the kind where you're not yet certain that something terrible has happened, but you are certain enough to be frightened. When it became clear that the Waratah was not delayed but missing, the search began. And the search is a story of its own, one that would stretch over weeks, cover hundreds of miles of some of the most difficult coastline in the southern hemisphere and find absolutely nothing. The scale of the absence when the searching ships returned with empty hands and empty logbooks was the thing that made the Waratah's disappearance so deeply strange and so impossible to simply file away and move on from. A ship that size, carrying that many people, should have left something behind. The question of why she did not is the question that the inquiry would have to confront, and that question is where this story goes next. The search began in earnest in the first days of August 1909, when it became undeniable that the Waratah was not simply delayed. But before we follow the searchers out along that coast, it is worth staying for a moment with the last confirmed sighting, with the Clan McIntyre's officers on their bridge, watching the Waratah draw away from them on the morning of July 27th, because there is something in that ordinary, unremarkable encounter that deserves more attention than it usually gets. The Bashi River mouth, where the two ships were when they exchanged signals, sits along what is known as the Wild Coast. The name is not poetic invention. It is a straightforward description of the place. The Wild Coast runs roughly from the Great Kei River in the south to the KwaZulu-Natal border in the north, a stretch of the Eastern Cape coastline that is among the most rugged and isolated in South Africa. There are almost no natural harbours along this stretch. The cliffs drop directly into the sea in many places, and the surf is heavy and persistent. The beaches that do exist are backed by dense vegetation and accessible only by difficult tracks. In 1909, this coastline was genuinely remote, not scenic remote the way travel writers use the word, but actually hard to reach and harder to search. There were no roads worth the name along much of it. The nearest towns were small and far apart. If a ship came to grief along the Wild Coast in those days, the chances of anyone on shore witnessing it, or of any wreckage being quickly discovered, were considerably lower than they would have been along a more settled stretch of coastline. The sea itself off the Wild Coast has its own character. The Agulhas current runs southwestward along the South African coast, close to the shore, strong and fast. It is one of the most powerful boundary currents in the world's oceans, moving warm Indian Ocean water at speeds that can reach 5 knots in its core. 5 knots does not sound like much until you consider that it is roughly the speed of a brisk walk, sustained continuously across hundreds of miles of open water. For a ship making 15 knots through calm water, the current is a manageable factor. For wreckage, for lifeboats, for bodies, for anything floating on the surface, the Agulhas current is something else entirely. It can move floating material very quickly and very far from where it entered the water. This would become relevant in the weeks that followed, when searchers tried to understand why nothing from the Waratah had come ashore. The Agulhas current also has another quality that is relevant to the Waratah's story. When the current runs hard to the southwest and encounters southwesterly swells coming up from the Southern Ocean and around the Cape, the two systems interact in ways that can produce extremely dangerous sea conditions. The swells are slowed and steepened by the opposing current. Waves that might be large but manageable in open ocean become shorter, steeper, and more chaotic when they run against a strong current. It is in these conditions that the phenomenon now known as rogue waves, abnormally large, steep, isolated waves that appear without warning, is most likely to form. The Agulhas current region has one of the highest concentrations of documented rogue wave events anywhere in the world. Sailors have known for generations that this stretch of coast is dangerous in a way that goes beyond ordinary rough weather. The specific science behind rogue waves was not formalized until the 1990s, when instruments on offshore platforms began recording waves that exceeded what the standard mathematical model said was possible. The Dropner wave, recorded on New Year's Day 1995 in the North Sea, was the first scientifically confirmed rogue wave. A wall of water roughly 26 metres high in a sea where the surrounding waves were considerably smaller. But the phenomenon itself, the experience of encountering a wave that was simply too large and too sudden to respond to, was not new to sailors in 1909. They just did not have a name for it. The Waratah disappeared in July, which is winter in the southern hemisphere. Winter off the wild coast means stronger winds, larger swells, more frequent storms, and the Agulhas current running at full force. It is the worst time of year to be on that stretch of water in a ship that anyone has doubted. And the Waratah, as we have already established, was a ship that some people had doubted. The officers of the Clan MacIntyre saw her on that July morning and found nothing to worry about. She was making way, she was on course, she appeared entirely normal. But normal, in those waters, in that season, was not the same as safe. What the Clan MacIntyre's officers could not have seen, and what no one on the surface could have seen, was what the sea was doing in the hours ahead of the Waratah's course. The wild coast does not give much warning. The weather can change quickly in winter, and the wave conditions can deteriorate faster than a ship's officers might expect, especially when the current and the swell are working against each other. The Waratah was heading southwest, into whatever the next stretch of that coastline and that current had waiting for her. The Clan MacIntyre's crew watched her go and thought nothing of it because there was nothing to think. She looked fine. She probably was fine at the moment they last saw her. Whatever happened, happened after that. The other sighting, the Guelph's possible identification of a ship matching the Waratah's description, is worth a brief mention, even with its uncertainty. The Union Castle liner Guelph was also in the area around the same time, and her officers reported seeing a large vessel that could have been the Waratah somewhat further along the coast, perhaps a little closer to Cape Town than the Clan MacIntyre's position. If the Guelph's sighting was accurate and correctly identified, it would push the last confirmed moment of the Waratah's existence a little further along the timeline, a little more distance covered, a little closer to her destination, before whatever happened, happened. But the inquiry treated this sighting with caution, and rightly so. The Guelph's officers were less certain of the identification than the Clan MacIntyre's. The description matched, but descriptions of large merchant steamers in 1909 matched a great many ships. The Clan MacIntyre's account is the one that stands, so the last solid data point is this. On the morning of July 27, 1909, the Waratah was near the Bashi River mouth on the wild coast of South Africa, heading southwest, apparently in normal condition, with 211 people aboard. The Clan MacIntyre's officers saw her, exchanged signals with her, and then went on their way. The Waratah continued on hers, and at some point after that, in some place along that rugged, current-swept, storm-prone stretch of coast, she ceased to exist as a functioning ship and became instead an absence so complete that it would take weeks of searching to confirm and more than a century of effort to still not fully explain. The completeness of that absence is worth dwelling on, because it is genuinely unusual. Ships that sink in shallow coastal waters tend to leave evidence. They leave wreckage on the surface, wooden fittings, furniture, cargo, personal belongings. They leave lifeboats, or pieces of lifeboats. They leave bodies, which even in cold water will eventually surface. They leave debris fields on the seabed that are detectable by anyone searching in the right area. The Waratah left none of these things in any confirmed form. The searches that began in early August 1909 covered the coastline and the adjacent waters systematically, and they found nothing that could be definitively connected to the ship. This was not a small search. Ships went out specifically to look for the Waratah. The Blue Anchor Line sent vessels. The Royal Navy assisted. The search extended along hundreds of miles of the wild coast and out into the open water beyond, and still nothing. One of the ships involved in the search was the Sabine, which works specifically along the wild coast, covering the area between the Bashi River and the waters further southwest. The conditions the Sabine encountered give some sense of what the searchers were dealing with. The wild coast in winter is not a comfortable place to operate a vessel. The swells are heavy, the surf makes it impossible to approach the shore closely in many places, and the coastline itself offers almost no shelter. Searching it by ship in 1909 meant staying offshore and scanning the coast visually, which meant that anything hidden in a cove, washed into a river mouth, or submerged just offshore might easily be missed. There was no aerial search. Aircraft capable of systematic coastal reconnaissance did not exist yet in any practical form. There was no sonar. Communication between the searching ships and the shore depended on telegraph lines that only reached the towns, not the open coast. The searchers were doing what they could with what they had, and what they had was not much by modern standards. The search continued into August and September 1909. As the weeks passed and nothing was found, the nature of the inquiry shifted from rescue to investigation. There was no longer any realistic hope that survivors would be found. The question became not where are the survivors, but what happened to the ship, and why has nothing been found? These are different questions, and they require different kinds of thinking. The first is a practical question of location and rescue. The second is a deeper, stranger question about the behaviour of the sea and the physics of a ship's destruction, and it does not always have a clean answer. The total absence of debris troubled people at the time, and it has troubled researchers ever since. There are explanations that could account for it, and we will come to those in time. The Agulhas current, moving at several knots, could carry floating material far from where it entered the water in a matter of days. The winter storms that may have sunk the ship could also have driven wreckage in unpredictable directions. The wild coast's lack of accessible beaches and its remote interior meant that even material that did come ashore might not have been found and reported quickly, if at all. Some items that wash ashore on remote coastlines are never reported. Some are found by people who do not recognise their significance. Some simply disintegrate before anyone sees them. These are all reasonable points, but they are also, in an honest accounting, somewhat speculative. They explain how the absence of debris is possible. They do not explain why it was so complete. What the search established, in its weeks of effort and its eventual failure, was the shape of the mystery. The Waratah was last seen in a specific place, at a specific time, appearing normal. She then disappeared without a trace along a coastline that, while difficult, was not entirely beyond the reach of searchers. The search was imperfect, but it was not negligible, and it found nothing. This was the situation that the Board of Trade Inquiry would have to confront when it convened in London in 1910. A ship gone, a search failed, and a question that the evidence alone could not fully answer. The inquiry would call witnesses, examine technical evidence, and try to construct a probable account of what had happened from the fragments that remained. It would arrive at a conclusion that was careful and reasonable, but also, by its own admission, uncertain. And that uncertainty is where the Waratah has lived ever since, in the gap between what is known and what can be proven, in the silence between the Clan MacIntyre's last signal and the empty arrival record in Cape Town. The inquiry is where the story goes next, and what it found, and what it could not find, tells us a great deal about both the ship and the limits of what any investigation can do when the evidence itself has vanished. The Board of Trade Inquiry opened in London in early 1910, and it was, by the standards of the time, a serious and thorough proceeding. These were not people going through the motions. The loss of 211 lives, the complete absence of wreckage, and the public attention that had gathered around the case all meant that the inquiry could not afford to be perfunctory. Witnesses were called from across the maritime world. Technical experts gave evidence. The men who had last seen the Waratah were questioned carefully about what they had observed. And Claude Sawyer, the passenger who had disembarked at Durban the day before the ship's final departure, was brought before the inquiry to explain, in his own words, why he had left. Sawyer's testimony is one of the more unusual pieces of evidence in any maritime inquiry on record. He described recurring visions or dreams during the voyage from Australia to Durban. A figure, he said, dressed in some kind of armour or strange clothing, holding a long sword that was dripping with blood. He interpreted this as a warning. He had also, by his own account, felt deeply uneasy about the ship's behaviour at sea. The rolling, the slow recovery, the sense that something was not right. When the Waratah reached Durban on July 25, 1909, Sawyer made up his mind. He got off. He sent a telegram to his wife explaining that he had left the ship because he believed it was unsafe. He then watched the Waratah depart the following morning and never saw her again. The inquiry did not treat Sawyer's visions as evidence of anything supernatural. It treated them, reasonably enough, as evidence of a passenger who had become genuinely frightened of the ship and had acted on that fear. What the inquiry found more interesting was the practical dimension of his testimony, his observations about the rolling, his general sense of instability. These matched what other passengers had reported on the maiden voyage, and they pointed toward the central technical question that the inquiry had to address. Was the Waratah a stable ship? The officers of the Clan MacIntyre were also called to give evidence. They had been the last people to see the Waratah in any confirmed account, and their testimony was important. They described the exchange of signals on the morning of July 27, 1909, off the Bashi River mouth. The Waratah, they said, appeared normal. She was proceeding at a reasonable speed. She was not listing visibly, and there was nothing in her appearance or behaviour that suggested she was in difficulty. The Clan MacIntyre continued on her own course, and the Waratah disappeared from view. That was the last anyone who survived would ever see of her. Naval architects and ship designers gave technical evidence about the Waratah's construction and her stability characteristics. This is where the inquiry became genuinely complicated, because the technical picture was not clean. The central concept under examination was metacentric height, which is usually referred to in the technical literature simply as GM. This is a measure of a ship's initial stability, her tendency to return to upright after being rolled to one side. A ship with a high GM is stiff. She rolls back quickly and sharply. A ship with a low GM is tender. She rolls slowly and takes longer to recover, and in extreme cases she may not recover at all. The Waratah, from the accounts of passengers and crew, had behaved like a tender ship, rolling heavily and pausing before returning upright, which is exactly the kind of behaviour that experienced sailors find unsettling. The question the inquiry had to answer was whether her GM was low enough to make her genuinely dangerous, or whether the complaints from passengers reflected the natural anxiety of people who were not accustomed to a large ship moving in heavy seas. These are not always easy to distinguish. Passengers on perfectly safe ships sometimes find the motion frightening. And naval architects looking at the Waratah's design specifications were divided. Some argued that her GM was within acceptable limits for a ship of her type and size. Others disagreed and suggested that her design placed her close to the lower edge of what was considered safe, with little margin for error if conditions deteriorated sharply. The cargo loading question also came into the discussion. On her final voyage, the Waratah was carrying approximately 6,500 tons of cargo. A significant portion of this was lead concentrates, which are dense and heavy and were stowed in the lower holds. In theory, heavy cargo low in a ship improves stability. It lowers the centre of gravity, which tends to increase GM. Some of the technical witnesses argued that this should have made the Waratah more stable on her final voyage than she had been on the maiden voyage. Others pointed out that the distribution of cargo across the ship mattered as much as the total weight, and that unevenly distributed cargo could create asymmetric stresses that a ship with marginal stability might struggle to manage. The inquiry examined the cargo manifests and the loading records, but the picture that emerged was not conclusive. There was also a more specific mechanical concern raised during the proceedings, the possibility of a synchronous roll. This is a phenomenon that occurs when a ship's natural rolling period, the time it takes to roll from one side to the other and back, matches the period of the waves she is encountering. When these two periods align, each wave reinforces the previous roll rather than interrupting it, and the rolling can build progressively, becoming more extreme with each cycle. In severe cases, a synchronous roll can overwhelm a ship's ability to recover, especially if she is already tender. The seas off the Wild Coast in winter, driven by the Agulhas current and the southwesterly swells that come around the Cape of Good Hope, can produce long, heavy swells with a fairly consistent period. Whether those swells matched the Waratah's rolling period on the night of July 27th is something no one can now determine, but the inquiry considered it a plausible contributing factor. The conclusion the inquiry reached was measured and careful. The most probable explanation the inquiry determined was that the Waratah had encountered a severe storm and had capsized, likely due to a combination of her stability characteristics and the extreme sea conditions in the region. The inquiry noted that a weather system had been moving through the area around the time of the disappearance, and that conditions off the Wild Coast in the days following the last sighting had been rough. This was not a dramatic finding, but it was a reasonable one. A tender ship in a serious storm on one of the more dangerous stretches of coastline in the southern hemisphere. The outcome, if something went wrong, could have been rapid and catastrophic. But the inquiry was honest about what it could not explain. It could not say with confidence exactly where the ship had gone down. It could not explain the complete absence of wreckage along a coastline that had been searched for weeks. It could not say whether the capsize had been sudden, fast enough that no distress signal could be sent, no lifeboats launched, no one left alive to report what had happened, or whether there had been some interval between the onset of the emergency and the final sinking. It could not rule out other possibilities entirely. The evidence simply did not reach that far. The inquiry gave a probable cause, and it gave a probable location in the general sense, and beyond that it could not go. The Waratah was recorded as lost at sea, because presumed to be capsizing in heavy weather, exact circumstances unknown. The Blue Anchor Line did not survive the loss. The Waratah had been their flagship, and the financial and reputational damage from her disappearance, combined with the scrutiny the inquiry brought to the line's operations, was more than the company could absorb. Within a year of the inquiry's conclusion, the Blue Anchor Line had sold its remaining vessels and ceased operations. The company that had built its ambitions around the Australia, South Africa, UK route simply ceased to exist. It is one of those quiet aftershocks that maritime disasters sometimes produce. Not just the loss of the ship, but the collapse of the enterprise that had sent her out. The families of the 211 people aboard were left in a particular kind of limbo that is difficult to fully appreciate now. There were no bodies, there was no confirmed date of death, no confirmed location. For legal purposes, for probate, for insurance, for the settling of estates, the absence of confirmation created complications that dragged on for years. Courts had to make determinations about death in the absence of the kind of evidence that normally supports such determinations. Some families waited longer than others for these processes to resolve. All of them were waiting for an answer that the inquiry had been unable to fully provide. What the inquiry left behind in the end was a formal record of a serious attempt to understand something that could not be fully understood. It is worth reading if you have the patience for early 20th century legal prose, because it is genuinely careful. The people conducting it were not fools, and they were not incurious. They asked the right questions. They examined the technical evidence seriously. They considered the meteorological data, the witness accounts, the cargo records, and the design specifications. They arrived at the most reasonable conclusion the evidence would support, and then they acknowledged in the measured language of official proceedings that the evidence was not sufficient to close the question entirely. That acknowledgement is, in a way, the most honest thing about the inquiry. It would have been easy, and perhaps more comfortable for everyone involved, to issue a definitive finding and move on. Instead, the inquiry said what it could say with confidence, and it stopped there. The Waratah was probably lost in a storm. She probably capsized. The sea conditions in the area were probably severe enough to account for the speed of the sinking. The stability concerns that had been raised on her maiden voyage were probably relevant, most likely, in all probability. In all. These are the phrases that run through the conclusion, and they are the honest phrases, because they reflect what the evidence actually supported. The absence that the search had established, no wreckage, no bodies, nothing confirmed, remained unexplained in any fully satisfying way. The inquiry noted it. It offered the Agulhas current as a partial explanation for how debris might have been dispersed. It acknowledged that the conditions along the wild coast made a thorough surface search difficult. But it did not pretend that these explanations were complete, because they were not. A 9,339-ton ship, carrying 6,500 tons of cargo, disappearing without leaving a confirmed trace along a coastline that was actively searched. That is not an ordinary outcome, even for a ship lost in severe weather. The inquiry knew this. It said so, quietly, in the language of official caution. And so the inquiry closed, and the official record was filed, and the Blue Anchor Line sold its ships, and the families of the 211 people aboard began the long, unresolved process of moving forward without answers. The Waratah passed from an active investigation into history, into the category of things that are known to have happened but not known to have been explained. She joined a small and unusual group of maritime losses, where the disappearance itself is more complete than the disaster that caused it, where the sea kept not just the ship but the evidence of what had happened to her. The inquiry had done what an inquiry can do. It had gathered what could be gathered, examined what could be examined, and concluded what the evidence permitted. What it could not do was go to the bottom of the sea and look. In 1910, that was simply not possible. The wreck, if it existed, and the inquiry assumed it did, somewhere along or near the wild coast, was beyond reach. It would remain beyond reach for decades. And the question of what exactly happened to the Waratah on the night of July 27, 1909, would remain open, waiting for either new evidence or new technology to bring it closer to resolution. The physical environment where she vanished is itself part of the story, and understanding it helps explain not just why the Waratah may have sunk, but why finding any trace of her proved so difficult, and why the mystery has persisted as long as it has. The wild coast is not a forgiving stretch of ocean, and the forces that shape it are larger and stranger than they might appear on a map. The Board of Trade inquiry opened in London in early 1910, roughly 6 months after the Waratah had failed to arrive in Cape Town. It was a formal proceeding, conducted with the seriousness that a loss of 211 lives demanded, and it drew together a wide range of witnesses, naval architects, officers from other ships, maritime experts, and at least one passenger whose testimony was unlike anything else in the record. The inquiry had a difficult task from the beginning. It was being asked to explain something for which there was almost no direct evidence. There was no wreck, there were no survivors, there were no distress signals received, no confirmed debris, no bodies. The inquiry was, in a sense, being asked to reconstruct an event from its absence, to work backward from a silence, and find the most plausible account of what produced it. Claude Sawyer was among the first significant witnesses. He was a businessman, not a sailor, and his testimony was unusual in ways that the inquiry handled with a certain careful restraint. Sawyer described the recurring visions he had experienced during the voyage from Australia to Durban. A figure, dressed in a kind of ancient or symbolic clothing, holding a sword that was wet with blood, appearing to him in a state between waking and dreaming. He said these visions came to him more than once during the crossing, and that they had strengthened a growing unease he already felt about the ship's behaviour at sea. He described the Waratah's rolling as heavy and slow, and said that on several occasions the ship had listed to one side, and held there for what felt to him like an uncomfortably long time before recovering. He said he had decided by the time the ship reached Durban that he would not continue aboard her. He disembarked on July 25, 1909. He sent a telegram to his wife explaining that he had left the ship because he believed it was unsafe. 2 days later, the Waratah departed Durban for the last time. The inquiry treated Sawyer's visions with a kind of polite neutrality. They were noted. They were not dismissed as irrelevant, because Sawyer himself was clearly not an irrational man, and his practical decision to leave the ship was grounded in something more than dreams. But the inquiry was not in the business of evaluating premonitions. What mattered to the formal record was his account of the ship's physical behaviour. The rolling, the slow recovery, the sense that something in the vessel's motion was not quite right. That part of his testimony was consistent with what other witnesses said, and it fed directly into the technical questions that were at the centre of the inquiry's work. Officers from the Clan McIntyre also testified. They described the sighting on the morning of July 27, 1909, near the mouth of the Bashi River on the Wild Coast. They had seen the Waratah clearly, exchanged signals with her, and reported that she appeared to be proceeding normally. There was nothing in her appearance or behaviour at that moment, from what they could observe at sea distance, that suggested anything was wrong. She was on her course. She was making reasonable speed. The sea conditions at that point were not extreme, though the weather was deteriorating. The officers of the Clan McIntyre had no reason to be alarmed by what they saw. They continued on their own course. They did not see the Waratah again, and no one else confirmed seeing her after that morning. This testimony was important because it established a final fixed point in the Waratah's story. Whatever happened to her happened after that sighting, in the hours that followed, somewhere along the coast to the southwest. The inquiry used this to narrow the probable location of the loss, though the area was still large enough to be practically unhelpful for a search. The Wild Coast runs for hundreds of miles, and the sea off it drops quickly to depths that, in 1910, were entirely beyond any possibility of investigation. The naval architects who appeared before the inquiry were the ones who carried the most technical weight. They were asked to evaluate the Waratah's design, her stability characteristics, and whether the concerns raised about her metacentric height were justified. The testimony on this point was not unanimous. Some architects argue that the Waratah's design was within acceptable parameters for a vessel of her type, and that her rolling behaviour, while noticeable, was not necessarily dangerous. Others were less comfortable with what the record showed. The question of metacentric height, the measurement that governs how quickly and confidently a ship returns to upright after rolling, was examined carefully, and the conclusions were genuinely divided. The cargo she was carrying on her final voyage added another layer of complexity to the stability analysis. The Waratah had approximately 6,500 tons of cargo in her holds, including a significant quantity of lead concentrates, a dense, heavy material that would have sat low in the ship and, in theory, lowered her centre of gravity. A lower centre of gravity generally improves a ship's initial stability, but the inquiry heard arguments that the distribution of this cargo may have been uneven, and that the effect of heavy low cargo on a ship's rolling behaviour is not always straightforwardly positive. A ship that is too stiff, too resistant to rolling in one direction, can, under certain wave conditions, develop a rolling motion that becomes self-reinforcing rather than self-correcting. The inquiry examined these arguments without being able to resolve them definitively, because the actual cargo loading records were incomplete, and the ship herself was not available for inspection. What the inquiry could say with reasonable confidence was this: the Waratah had been the subject of stability concerns from her earliest voyages. Those concerns had been raised by passengers, and by at least one engineer. They had been communicated to the Blue Anchor Line. The line had judged the ship seaworthy and continued to operate her. Whether that judgment was correct, or whether the concerns reflected a genuine and dangerous flaw in the ship's design, was something the inquiry could not determine with certainty. The evidence pointed toward risk. It did not prove inevitability. The meteorological evidence the inquiry considered was also significant, though it too was incomplete in the way that weather records from that era tend to be. It was known that a severe storm had moved through the region of the Wild Coast in the days following the last sighting of the Waratah. Ships that had been in the area around that time reported rough conditions, heavy seas, strong winds, the kind of weather that the South African winter coast produces with some regularity. The inquiry concluded that the Waratah had almost certainly encountered this storm, and that the combination of severe sea conditions and whatever stability characteristics she actually possessed had most likely resulted in capsizing. This was the central conclusion. The ship had probably been overwhelmed by weather, had probably capsized, and had probably sunk quickly enough that no distress signal was sent and no lifeboats were launched in any effective way. Probably. The word keeps appearing, and it is worth sitting with it for a moment. An inquiry into the loss of 211 people, conducted by serious and experienced officials examining the best available evidence, arrived at a conclusion built almost entirely on probability, not certainty, not proof. The most reasonable inference from what could be known. That is an honest outcome given what the evidence actually was, but it is also a deeply unsatisfying one, and the inquiry knew it. The formal record reflects this. The language is careful not to claim more than the evidence supports, and in that carefulness there is an implicit acknowledgement that the central question, what exactly happened, and where, and why no trace was found, had not been answered. The Blue Anchor Line's fate was effectively sealed before the inquiry concluded. The Waratah had been their flagship, the most ambitious ship in their fleet, the vessel around which they had built their plans for the Australia route. Her loss was catastrophic in every dimension. The financial cost was enormous. The reputational damage was severe. The scrutiny the inquiry brought to the line's operations and to the decisions that had been made about the Waratah's seaworthiness, despite the concerns raised on her maiden voyage, was not comfortable reading for the company's management. There is a question that hangs over the Blue Anchor Line's handling of the stability complaints that was never fully answered by the inquiry. Did the line know more than it acted on? Were the concerns raised by passengers and crew taken seriously, evaluated properly and found to be insufficient? Or were they noted and set aside because the commercial pressures of operating a new flagship on a competitive route made addressing them inconvenient? The inquiry did not accuse the line of negligence in any sharp or definitive way, but the weight of the evidence it assembled did not reflect well on the decisions that had been made. Within a year of the inquiry's close, the Blue Anchor Line had sold its remaining vessels and ceased operations entirely. The company was gone. The route that had been its ambition was taken over by other carriers. The Waratah had, in sinking, taken the enterprise that built her down with it. For the families of the 211 people aboard, the inquiry's conclusion brought a kind of official acknowledgement, but not the closure that acknowledgement might have provided if it had come with more certainty. The finding that the ship had probably capsized in a storm gave them a framework for understanding what had happened. It did not give them a date, a location, a confirmed account of the ship's final hours, or the knowledge of where their family members now rested. The legal complications that followed from this uncertainty were real and prolonged. With no confirmed date of death and no confirmed location, establishing the legal status of the deceased for the purposes of probate and estate settlement required courts to make determinations in the absence of the kind of documentation those processes normally require. Some families navigated this relatively quickly, others found it a long and frustrating process. All of them were working through grief in a context where the loss itself had not been fully confirmed, where some small part of the mind might still wonder, in the way that the mind does when there is no body and no wreck, whether the absence of proof meant something other than what it appeared to mean. There is something particular about a loss of this kind, not just the scale of it, but the completeness of the silence that followed. Maritime disasters in the early 20th century were not uncommon. Ships were lost with some regularity to storms, to navigational errors, to mechanical failures, to fire. In most of those cases, something remained. Wreckage, survivors, bodies. A lifeboat found weeks later. Something that confirmed the event and gave it a location in the physical world. The Waratah offered none of that. The inquiry had done everything an inquiry could do in 1910, which was to gather testimony and documents and technical analysis and reason carefully from them. It could not go to the seabed, it could not examine the wreck, it could not look at the hull and determine whether she had capsized or burned or broken apart or been struck by something no one anticipated. The conclusion it reached was the best available inference from incomplete evidence, and it was filed as such, and the case was formally closed in the way that official proceedings must eventually close, even when the underlying question remains open. What the inquiry left behind was a record of serious effort and genuine uncertainty. It had established the probable cause without proving it. It had identified the probable location without confirming it. It had examined the stability concerns without resolving them, and it had noted, without being able to explain, the extraordinary absence of physical evidence that made the Waratah's disappearance different from almost any other maritime loss of its era. The inquiry was, in the end, a document of what could be known about something that had refused to be fully known. The ship was gone. The company was gone. The inquiry was closed. And the wild coast continued as it had always been, rugged and remote and indifferent to the questions that human beings were asking about what lay beneath it. To understand why the Waratah's disappearance was so complete, and why the search that followed it found nothing, it helps to understand the physical environment where she was last seen. The sea off the wild coast of South Africa is not ordinary ocean. It is shaped by forces that operate on a scale that makes individual ships feel very small indeed, and those forces were at work in July 1909 just as they are today. What the ocean does there, and why it does it, is a significant part of the Waratah's story, and it may be the most important part of the explanation for why she has never been found. The wild coast of South Africa is one of those places that feels like it exists slightly outside the normal world. It runs for roughly 300 kilometres along the eastern coastline of what is now the Eastern Cape Province, between the Mtamvuna River in the north and the Great Kei River in the south. There are almost no harbours along this stretch. There are very few roads that reach the water. The cliffs drop directly into the sea in many places, and where there are beaches, the surf comes in hard and fast and without much warning. The name is not poetic exaggeration. It is a practical description of what the coast actually is. Wild in the old sense of the word, meaning largely untamed, difficult to access, and unforgiving to ships that come too close to it. In July 1909, this coastline was even more remote than it is today. There were no radio stations monitoring ship traffic. There were no Coast Guard stations with fast vessels ready to respond. The telegraph could carry news from one town to another, but it could not reach the sea itself. If a ship went into trouble along the wild coast in 1909, the chances of anyone on shore knowing about it quickly were very low. The chances of anyone being able to reach the ship in time to help were lower still. This is not a criticism of the people who lived there or of the maritime systems of the time. It is simply the reality of what that coastline was and what it meant for a ship in distress. But the remoteness of the coast, while significant, is not the most important physical factor in the Waratah story. The most important factor is what the ocean itself does in that region, and it is something that the sailors of 1909 understood in a practical, experiential way without having the scientific vocabulary to describe it fully. The Agulhas Current is one of the strongest ocean currents on Earth. It runs southwestward along the eastern coast of South Africa, flowing from the warm waters of the Indian Ocean down toward the tip of the continent. At its core, it can move at speeds of up to 5 knots, which does not sound dramatic until you remember that 5 knots is a reasonable speed for a small vessel under power, and that this current is not a narrow channel, but a body of moving water that can be 60 to 100 kilometres wide. The Agulhas Current carries an enormous volume of warm water with it, and it runs close to the coast, particularly close in the stretch between Durban and East London, which is precisely the stretch of water where the Waratah was last seen. The current itself is not the danger. The danger is what happens when the current meets something coming from the opposite direction. The Southern Ocean, which wraps around the bottom of the globe below the tip of Africa, generates some of the largest storm swells in the world. These swells travel northeastward and then curve around the Cape of Good Hope, arriving off the South African coast as long, powerful waves moving broadly from the southwest. When a southwesterly swell runs into the Agulhas current moving in the opposite direction, the interaction between them does something to the waves that is deeply counterintuitive if you have not seen it or studied it. Waves moving against a strong opposing current become steeper. Their wavelength, the distance from one crest to the next, compresses. Their height increases. The energy that was spread across a longer, more gradual wave gets concentrated into something shorter and more vertical. The result can be waves that are far larger and far steeper than the swell conditions alone would produce, and in certain circumstances, particularly when the current is running strongly and the swell is large and the geometry of the interaction is right, this process can produce what are now called rogue waves, single waves, or groups of waves that are dramatically larger than the surrounding sea state. The term rogue wave was treated with some skepticism by oceanographers for a long time. Sailors had been reporting them for centuries. Waves that appeared without warning, that were 2 or 3 times the height of the surrounding waves, that struck ships with a force that seemed out of proportion to the conditions. For a long time, the scientific consensus was that these reports were exaggerated, or that the sailors had misperceived conditions in a storm, or that the statistics of wave formation simply did not allow for waves that large. Then, on the 1st of January 1995, an oil platform called the Draupner platform in the North Sea recorded a single wave with a crest height of approximately 18.5 metres during a storm in which the surrounding waves were averaging around 12 metres. This was the first scientifically instrumented, unambiguous measurement of a rogue wave. It was not a sailor's account that could be questioned or dismissed. It was a data record from sensors on a fixed structure. After the Draupner measurement, the scientific conversation about rogue waves changed substantially, and subsequent research confirmed that they occur more frequently than the older statistical models had predicted, and that the Agulhas Current region off South Africa is one of the places in the world where they are most likely to form. None of this scientific framework existed in 1909. The Board of Trade inquiry that examined the Waratah's disappearance in 1910 did not have the concept of a rogue wave to work with. The naval architects who gave evidence could discuss storm conditions, wave heights, and the ship's stability characteristics, but they could not point to a specific wave phenomenon and say, this is what probably happened. What they could say, and what experienced sailors of the era already knew from painful experience, was that the waters off the wild coast in winter were extremely dangerous, and that ships had been lost there before. July is the heart of the South African winter. The storms that come up from the Southern Ocean during this season can be severe, and the combination of those storms with the Agulhas current creates conditions that have claimed ships across many decades. The Waratah disappeared in this season, in this region, and the timing is not coincidental. Whatever happened to her, it happened in an environment that was already known to be hostile, in a season when that hostility was at its peak. What a rogue wave would have meant for a ship like the Waratah is worth thinking through carefully, because it helps explain the one fact that puzzles people most about her disappearance: the total absence of any debris. A wave of sufficient size and steepness striking a ship broadside or from an angle that the hull could not manage could capsize a vessel very quickly. If the Waratah was already rolling in a way that concerned experienced sailors, as the testimony from her maiden voyage suggested, then a wave that pushed her past her point of recovery would not need to be impossibly large. It would need to be large enough, at the right moment, in the right direction. And if she went over quickly enough, the crew would have had no time to launch lifeboats, no time to send a distress signal, no time to do anything other than hold on to whatever was nearest. The question of why no debris was found is harder to answer, but the Agulhas current provides at least a partial explanation. A current moving at up to 5 knots, running along a coastline, and then sweeping around the tip of the continent, can carry floating material a very long distance in a very short time. Wooden lifeboats, deck furniture, cargo crates, personal belongings. Anything that floated and was released when the ship went down would have been picked up by the current and moved rapidly away from the site of the sinking. Within a day, floating debris could be dozens of miles from where the ship went down. Within a week, it could be hundreds of miles away. The search that was conducted in the weeks after the Waratah's disappearance focused on the wild coast and the waters immediately around it, which was the logical place to search. But if the current had carried everything away before the search began, the searchers would have been looking in the right general area for a ship that had left no trace there. There is also the question of what sinks and what floats. A steel hull obviously sinks. The cargo, lead concentrates among other things, heavy and dense, sinks. The anchors, the engines, the boilers, the structural elements of the ship, all of these go straight down. What floats is the lighter material. Wood, fabric, personal items, life belts. And life belts in 1909 were not the bright orange foam devices that modern ships carry. They were cork and canvas, and while they floated, they were not necessarily visible from a distance, and they were not designed to remain at the surface indefinitely. If the current dispersed them quickly, and if the search ships were not in the right place at the right time, it is possible, not certain, but possible, that debris existed and was simply not found before it sank or drifted beyond the search area. This does not fully resolve the puzzle. People who have studied the Waratah's disappearance closely have noted that the complete absence of any confirmed debris across a search that lasted weeks and covered hundreds of miles is still unusual, even accounting for the current. Other ships lost in similar circumstances in the same region left some trace. The Waratah left none that was ever confirmed. Some researchers have suggested that she may have sunk in deeper water than the search assumed, which would have taken everything down quickly and kept it down. Others have suggested that the current conditions on the specific days after her disappearance were particularly strong, carrying debris far beyond the search area before anyone knew to look for it. These are reasonable possibilities. They are not proven. What is established, and what matters for understanding the Waratah's story, is that the physical environment where she disappeared was, and remains, one of the most dangerous stretches of ocean in the southern hemisphere. The Agulhas current is not a background detail. It is a central character in what happened to the ship, whether as the mechanism that created the wave or waves that sank her, or as the force that erased the evidence of her sinking, or both. The sailors of 1909 who knew these waters respected them. The captains who ran the South Africa route knew that the wild coast in winter required caution. Captain Ilbery was an experienced man. He would have known this too. And yet the Waratah was last seen on the morning of July 27th, 1909, sailing in the direction of Cape Town, looking normal to the officers of the Clan MacIntyre who watched her pass. Whatever the sea did to her, it did it after that last sighting, somewhere in the hours that followed, in waters that were already carrying within them the potential for something catastrophic. The Agulhas current was running. The winter swells were coming around the Cape. The ship was loaded with cargo, carrying 211 people, and making her way through one of the most demanding stretches of ocean on the route. The environment alone does not explain everything. It explains how a ship might sink quickly, without warning, without time for a distress signal. It offers a mechanism for the dispersal of debris. It provides a context in which the total absence of evidence becomes, if not fully explained, at least less impossible to imagine. But the question of whether the Waratah was capable of surviving that environment, whether her design and her loading and her stability characteristics gave her a reasonable chance in the conditions she encountered, is a separate question, and it is the one that the naval architects at the Board of Trade Inquiry spent the most time trying to answer. Because if the environment was the cause, the environment alone was not the only factor. The ship's own nature was part of the equation too. And that part of the story is considerably more complicated than the geography of the wild coast or the physics of the Agulhas current. So let us spend some time with the stability question, because it is genuinely complicated, and because the people who argued about it at the inquiry were not simply trading opinions. They were working through real engineering problems with incomplete data, trying to determine whether a ship that no longer existed had been safe to sail. The concept at the centre of all of this is metacentric height, usually abbreviated as GM. It sounds technical, and it is, but the basic idea is not difficult to follow. When a ship rolls to one side, the geometry of its hull changes in the water. The centre of buoyancy, the point around which the upward force of the water acts, shifts. The metacentre is the theoretical point above the ship's centre of gravity, through which that buoyant force acts as the ship rolls. The distance between the ship's centre of gravity and the metacentre is the GM. If that distance is large and positive, the ship has strong righting force. It rolls and comes back firmly and quickly. If the GM is small, the righting force is weak, and the ship rolls more slowly, more lazily, and takes longer to return upright. If the GM is negative, if the centre of gravity is above the metacentre, the ship is unstable and will capsize. The Waratah was not reported to have a negative GM. Nobody at the inquiry argued that she was simply upside down waiting to happen under normal conditions. The concern was more nuanced than that. The argument was that her GM was too low, not negative, but small enough that in severe conditions, with large waves applying force to her hull repeatedly, she might not recover quickly enough. She might roll to one side, hang there for a moment longer than she should, and if another wave caught her in that position, the combination could push her past the point of no return. Passengers who sailed on her maiden voyage described exactly this kind of behaviour. The rolling was described as slow and heavy. Some said she would lean to one side and seem to hesitate before coming back. Experienced sailors tend to notice this. A ship that rolls quickly and recovers sharply feels lively but controllable. A ship that rolls slowly and pauses feels different, not necessarily dangerous, but unsettling in a way that is hard to explain to someone who has not felt it. The passengers who mentioned it were not all nautical experts, but the feeling they described was consistent enough across different accounts that it could not simply be dismissed as the complaints of nervous travellers. The naval architects who testified at the inquiry disagreed with each other, which is not unusual in these situations. One view was that the Waratah's metacentric height, while on the lower end, was within acceptable limits for a ship of her type. The Blue Anchor Line had commissioned her with specific requirements. She needed to carry cargo efficiently. She needed to accommodate passengers in reasonable comfort. She needed to maintain a service speed of around 15 knots. These requirements shaped her design. A ship built to carry heavy cargo and move efficiently through the water is not always built with the same stability margins as a dedicated passenger liner. The trade-offs are real, and they were understood by the designers, even if the passengers rolling around in their cabins did not know about them. The opposing view at the inquiry was that the Waratah's GM had been calculated incorrectly, or that her actual behaviour at sea demonstrated a problem that the calculations had not fully captured. This is not an unusual situation in naval architecture. A ship's theoretical stability and her actual behaviour at sea can differ, depending on how she's loaded, how the cargo shifts, how the water she takes on in rough conditions affects her trim, and a dozen other variables that are difficult to predict precisely on a drawing board in Glasgow. What makes the cargo question particularly relevant is that the Waratah's final loading was different from her maiden voyage. On her last departure from Durban on July 26, 1909, she was carrying approximately 6,500 tons of cargo. Among that cargo was a significant quantity of lead concentrates, dense, heavy material loaded into the lower holds. Lead concentrates are not light. They are exactly the kind of cargo that, when stowed low in the ship, lowers the centre of gravity and theoretically improves stability. A lower centre of gravity increases the GM, which should make the ship more stable, not less. This is one of the genuinely puzzling aspects of the stability argument. If the Waratah was more heavily loaded with dense cargo in her lower holds on her final voyage than she had been on her maiden voyage, her stability should, by the basic mathematics, have been better. Some of the naval architects at the inquiry made exactly this point. If the ship was dangerously unstable, they argued, it was harder to explain why she was more stable on the voyage she disappeared on than she had been on the voyage where passengers complained about her rolling. The counter-argument involved the distribution of that cargo, not just its total weight. A ship can have a low centre of gravity overall, but still have problems if the weight is not evenly distributed across the length and breadth of the hull. Uneven loading can create a list, a permanent lean to one side, or it can affect how the ship responds to waves coming from different directions. Some researchers have suggested that the Waratah's cargo may have been unevenly distributed on her final voyage, though the precise loading records were not available to the inquiry, and this remains speculative. There is another stability concept that comes into play here, and it is one that the inquiry touched on without fully resolving: synchronous rolling. This is the phenomenon where a ship's natural rolling period, the time it takes her to roll from one side to the other and back, matches the period of the wave she's sailing through. When this happens, each wave reinforces the previous roll rather than interrupting it. The rolls build on each other. A ship that might handle a single large wave without difficulty can, in a synchronous rolling situation, find herself rolling progressively further with each successive wave until she reaches an angle from which she cannot recover. The natural rolling period of a ship depends on her GM. A ship with a low GM rolls slowly, which means her natural period is long. She takes many seconds to complete each roll. Long-period waves, the kind that build up over hundreds of miles of open ocean in a severe storm, can have periods of 15, 20, even 30 seconds. The Agulhas Current region in winter, with swells coming around the Cape of Good Hope from the Southern Ocean, produces exactly these kinds of long, deep swells. If the Waratah's natural rolling period happened to match the period of the swells she encountered on the night of July 26th or the morning of July 27th, the result could have been a progressive build-up of rolling that overwhelmed her ability to recover. This is not a fringe theory. Synchronous rolling is a well-understood phenomenon in naval architecture and has been implicated in a number of maritime disasters. It does not require a rogue wave. It does not require a single catastrophic event. It requires the wrong ship in the wrong sea state at the wrong moment, and the accumulation of energy in the rolling motion gradually exceeds what the ship can withstand. For a ship with a low GM, the threshold is lower. The margin for error is smaller. What the inquiry could not do, and this is the honest answer to why it remained inconclusive, was determine the sea state that the Waratah actually encountered after the Clan MacIntyre last saw her. The weather records from July 27th, 1909, along the Wild Coast are not detailed enough to reconstruct exactly what conditions existed in the specific area where the ship disappeared. There were storms in the region. The winter of 1909 was not unusually mild, but whether the Waratah encountered a severe gale, a moderate gale, a rogue wave, or some combination of all three is simply not known. Without knowing the conditions, the stability question cannot be fully resolved. You cannot say definitively that a ship with a GM of X would have capsized in a sea state of Y if you do not know what Y was. The inquiry's conclusion, that the Waratah most likely capsized due to a combination of her stability characteristics and severe weather, was a reasonable inference from the available evidence. It was not a proven fact. The naval architects who testified did not all agree on the stability question. The weather data was incomplete, and the ship herself had left no evidence to examine. The inquiry was working with witness testimony, design documents, and general knowledge of the sea conditions in that region. It was doing the best it could with what it had. What is perhaps most striking, looking back at the inquiry from more than a century later, is how much the participants understood about what might have happened and how little they could actually prove. The mechanisms they discussed, Low metacentric height, synchronous rolling, rogue waves, rapid capsize are all real. The physical environment they described was genuinely dangerous. The concerns that passengers had raised about the ship's rolling were documented and credible, and yet none of it added up to a definitive answer because the ship was gone and the sea had kept its silence. There is something worth pausing on here. The Waratah was not a poorly built ship in the sense that she was shoddily constructed or obviously defective. Barclay, Curle and Company were a reputable Glasgow shipyard. The Blue Anchor Line was not a reckless operator. Captain Ilbery was experienced and respected. The ship had completed her maiden voyage, returned to London, and set out again on her second voyage without any formal finding that she was unsafe. The concerns that existed were noted, discussed, and ultimately set aside by the people whose job it was to make those decisions. Whether that was negligence or reasonable professional judgment in the context of what was known at the time is a question that the inquiry grappled with and did not fully resolve either. What we're left with, on the stability question, is a picture of a ship that was probably on the lower end of the acceptable stability range, sailing through one of the most demanding stretches of ocean on her route, in winter, carrying a large cargo whose distribution we cannot fully verify, in sea conditions we cannot precisely reconstruct. Each of those factors individually might not have been decisive. Together, they may have created a situation where a ship that was within the limits under normal conditions found herself outside those limits when the conditions were not normal. That is a plausible story. It is consistent with what the inquiry found. It is consistent with what we know about the Agulhas Current and the Wild Coast. It is consistent with what passengers observed on the maiden voyage. But plausible is not the same as proven, and the Waratah's disappearance has never been explained with the kind of certainty that comes from physical evidence. From a wreck you can look at, a hull you can examine, a structure that tells you what happened to it. The stability debate, for all its technical detail, ultimately circles back to the same absence that defines the entire story. Without the wreck, the argument remains open. The naval architects at the inquiry could disagree, and both sides could be right in the sense that neither could be definitively wrong. The ship herself, sitting somewhere on the seabed of the Wild Coast, is the only thing that could settle the question, and the ship has not been found. Which brings us naturally to the other theories about what happened to the Waratah, the explanations that do not rely solely on instability and weather, and that attempt to account for the one fact that the stability argument alone does not fully explain, the complete, total, almost incomprehensible absence of any confirmed wreckage or debris from a 9,000-ton ship that disappeared within sight of a known coastline. So let us think about the other possibilities, the ones that sit alongside the stability argument, sometimes overlapping with it, sometimes pointing in a different direction entirely. The most straightforward alternative is fire. Ships caught fire in the early 20th century with some regularity. Coal-fired boilers, wooden interiors, lamp oil, stored cargo. The conditions aboard a passenger cargo liner of that era were not forgiving if something went wrong in the engine room or in the hold. A fire that started below decks and spread quickly could theoretically have destroyed a ship fast enough to prevent any distress signal, fast enough to overwhelm the crew before lifeboats could be launched, and there is a detail here that has circulated in accounts of the Waratah disappearance for many years. A report made at the time of a ship seen on fire off the South African coast around the same period that the Waratah disappeared. This account has never been conclusively confirmed as referring to the Waratah. The source is not entirely clear, the location was vague, and no other vessel reported seeing a fire in the same area at the same time. It may have been a different ship entirely. It may have been a misidentification or an exaggeration. The South African coast in July 1909 had other maritime traffic, and a ship seen burning in the distance might have been any number of vessels. But the account has persisted, partly because it offers one explanation for why the Waratah left no survivors and no distress signal. If the fire was catastrophic and fast enough, there would have been no time for either. The problem with the fire theory, like every other theory, is the debris. A ship destroyed by fire does not simply disappear. The steel hull remains, the boilers remain, the engine components remain. If the Waratah burned and sank, the wreck would still be on the seabed, and a fire would not prevent that wreck from being found. So the fire theory, even if it explains the speed of the sinking and the absence of survivors, does not explain the absence of the wreck. It shifts the question rather than answering it. There is also the possibility of structural failure. A hull fracture, sometimes called breaking her back, occurs when the stresses on a ship's hull exceed what the structure can bear. In heavy seas, a ship riding over a large wave can experience enormous bending forces, with the bow and stern unsupported while the midship section bears the weight of the entire vessel. If the hull is not strong enough, or if there is a pre-existing weakness, the ship can fracture. This happens quickly. It can happen with very little warning. A ship that breaks in two can sink in minutes. The Waratah was built by a reputable yard to the standards of the time, and there is no specific evidence of a structural defect that was identified before her disappearance. But the Board of Trade Inquiry did not have access to the hull for examination, and the design specifications alone cannot rule out a weakness that only became apparent under extreme loading conditions. Some researchers have noted that the combination of a large cargo, heavy rolling, and severe wave action could have imposed stresses on the hull that exceeded what the designers anticipated. This is speculative. It is not supported by specific evidence about the Waratah's construction, but it is not impossible, and a hull fracture would produce a rapid sinking that could explain the absence of a distress signal. Again though, a structural failure would leave a wreck. It would leave two sections of wreck in fact. The debris argument applies here just as much as it does to the fire theory. A ship that breaks apart and sinks does not vanish. The pieces go to the bottom and they stay there. This brings us to the hardest part of the Waratah mystery, the part that no single theory fully accounts for, and the part that makes the disappearance feel genuinely strange rather than simply tragic. The complete absence of confirmed wreckage or debris from a 9,000-ton steel ship that disappeared within a reasonable distance of a known coastline and a known shipping lane. When a large ship sinks, it leaves things behind. This is not a general statement. It is a practical observation borne out by almost every major maritime disaster in history. When the Titanic went down in April 1912, bodies and debris were recovered from the surface within days. When other liners sank in the Atlantic and Pacific, wreckage washed ashore. Even ships sunk in wartime, sometimes deliberately targeted to prevent survivors, left floating debris fields. A passenger cargo liner of the Waratah's size carried wooden lifeboats, wooden deck fittings, furniture, crates of cargo, personal luggage, barrels, rope, canvas, cork life preservers. If she sank, by any mechanism, some of this material should have floated. Some of it should have been found. The searches conducted in August and September of 1909 covered hundreds of miles of the wild coast and the surrounding waters. They found nothing, no lifeboat, no crate, no body, no piece of timber that could be identified as coming from the Waratah. The ships that searched the coastline reported the same blankness everywhere they looked. The shore parties who walked sections of the wild coast found nothing either. One explanation that has been offered for this absence is the Agulhas current, and it is worth taking this seriously, because the Agulhas is not a gentle drift. It is one of the strongest ocean currents in the world, running at up to 5 knots along the South African coast in a southwestward direction. Anything floating on the surface in that current would be moved rapidly away from the area. Within 24 hours, debris could be carried 50 or 60 miles. Within a week, it could be hundreds of miles from the point of sinking, dispersed across a wide area of open ocean, far from any shipping lane, unlikely to be seen by any vessel. Some researchers have used this argument to suggest that the debris from the Waratah simply ended up somewhere where no one was looking for it, far out into the South Atlantic, or carried around the Cape of Good Hope and into different waters entirely. The Agulhas current does not flow in a perfectly straight line. It meanders, it sheds eddies, and material caught in it can be distributed in complex patterns that are difficult to predict, even with modern oceanographic models. In 1909, with no aerial search, no satellite imagery, and ships that could only cover so much ground, a debris field that had been carried away from the search area might simply never have been encountered. This is a plausible argument. It is not a complete answer, because some debris, particularly heavier items or items that became waterlogged and sank slowly, would have ended up on the seabed relatively close to the sinking site rather than being carried far away. And the wild coast itself, with its rocky shoreline and strong surf, should have caught at least some floating material if the ship went down anywhere near the coast. The fact that nothing came ashore is harder to explain by current dispersal alone. There's also a simpler, quieter possibility that sometimes gets overlooked in the more dramatic theories. The Waratah may have sunk in water deep enough and far enough offshore that her debris sank before it could be seen. Not everything from a sinking ship floats indefinitely. Waterlogged timber sinks, bodies sink, cargo sinks. If the ship went down quickly and the debris field was small to begin with, because the sinking was fast and violent rather than slow, the window in which anything was visible on the surface might have been very short. A ship that capsized suddenly in heavy weather, rolled over and went down in minutes, might have produced a debris field that was already dispersed and partially submerged by the time the next ship passed through the area. None of these explanations is fully satisfying. Each one accounts for part of the picture and leaves part of it unexplained. The fire theory explains the speed but not the wreck. The structural failure theory explains the speed but not the debris. The current dispersal theory explains the absence of surface debris but not the absence of anything on the shoreline. The rapid capsize theory explains the absence of a distress signal but raises questions about why even a small amount of floating material was not found. What is interesting, and this is one of those things that makes the Waratah genuinely unusual, rather than just another maritime disaster, is that the combination of factors required to produce a complete absence of evidence is itself unusual. Most ship disappearances, even mysterious ones, leave something. A lifeboat washed ashore years later, a piece of timber identified by its fittings, a body recovered miles from where the ship went down. The Waratah left none of this, or at least none that was ever confirmed. There have been occasional claims over the years. A life preserver found on a beach that some believed came from the Waratah, pieces of timber that were suggested to be from the ship's fittings. None of these have been verified. None have been traced back to the Waratah with any certainty. They remain anecdotal, unconfirmed, part of the folklore that tends to accumulate around any long-running mystery. There was also, for a time, a theory involving a more dramatic and unusual event, a tsunami or submarine landslide that could have produced an abnormal wave capable of overwhelming a ship instantly. The wild coast sits in a geologically active region, and submarine landslides along the continental shelf have been documented in the South African coastal zone. A large underwater landslide can generate a localized wave of considerable height, different from a storm wave in its character, steeper, faster, with less warning. Some researchers have suggested this as a possible mechanism for the Waratah's disappearance. It remains highly speculative. There is no documented evidence of a submarine landslide in the area at the relevant time, and the geological record for 1909 in that specific region is not detailed enough to confirm or rule it out. What keeps coming back, regardless of which theory you examine, is that central absence. The ship was seen on the morning of July 27, 1909, by the officers of the Clan McIntyre. She appeared normal. She was steaming southward along the wild coast, heading for Cape Town. And then, at some point after that sighting, an hour later, 3 hours later, half a day later, something happened. Something that was over quickly enough that no signal was sent. No lifeboat was launched in a way that survived. No debris was recovered in any confirmed form. Something that left a 9,000-ton ship and 211 people as simply absent from the world, without explanation, without trace. The theories all circle this moment. They all try to fill the gap between the last sighting and the silence, and none of them can do it completely, because the evidence required to fill that gap is sitting somewhere on the seabed of the wild coast, or dispersed across a stretch of the South Atlantic and has not yet been found. It is worth saying plainly, the most likely explanation, based on what we know about the ship, the sea and the conditions, is still some combination of instability and severe weather. A rapid capsize in conditions that overwhelmed a ship that was already on the lower end of the stability range. That is what the inquiry concluded, and the decades of subsequent analysis have not produced a better supported alternative. But the fire accounts, the structural failure arguments, and the current dispersal theory are not simply fringe speculation. They are genuine attempts to account for the specific details of the disappearance, and they deserve to be considered seriously, even if they ultimately raise as many questions as they answer. The Waratah's disappearance is not a mystery in the sense of a puzzle with a hidden solution that someone is concealing. It is a mystery in the older, quieter sense. Something that happened that was real, that had causes and a sequence of events, and that we simply do not have enough information to fully reconstruct. The sea does not hide things deliberately. It is just very large and very deep, and in 1909, the tools available to search it were very limited, which is exactly why the searches that followed over the decades, the expeditions, the sonar sweeps, the remote vehicle dives, matter so much to this story. Because somewhere beneath the surface of that water, the answer may still be there, waiting for the right equipment and the right moment to finally be found. And so people tried to find her. That is perhaps the most human part of this entire story. Not just that the Waratah vanished, but that for more than a century, people have refused to accept that she is simply gone. The searching did not stop with the Royal Navy vessels that combed the wild coast in August and September of 1909. It continued in various forms across the decades that followed, driven by researchers, historians, maritime enthusiasts, and at least one man who devoted a significant portion of his life to the question. The early searches, of course, were limited by the technology of the time. In 1909, searching a stretch of open ocean meant putting ships on the water and having crew members look over the sides. There was no way to see beneath the surface, no sonar, no underwater cameras, no way to map the seabed with any precision. The searchers could only hope to find floating debris, or wreckage washed ashore, or some visible sign on the surface of the water. When none of that appeared, the search eventually wound down, not because anyone believed the question was answered, but because there was simply nothing left to look for that could be seen with the naked eye from the deck of a ship. Over the following decades, the Waratah became one of those cases that maritime researchers returned to periodically, usually when a new piece of technology or a new account surfaced that seemed to offer a fresh angle. There were occasional claims of wreckage sighted on the seabed by fishermen, or of unusual sonar returns picked up by vessels working in the area. Most of these led nowhere. Some were investigated briefly and then quietly set aside when they turned out to be geological features, or other wrecks entirely, or simply errors in the original reporting. The wild coast of South Africa is not a place that makes searching easy, even with modern equipment. The coastline itself is remote, rugged cliffs, no significant harbours for much of its length, small fishing communities and not much else. The sea conditions in that area are frequently rough, especially in winter, and the Agulhas current running close inshore creates strong subsurface flows that complicate any kind of underwater work. The seabed in the search zone is not flat or simple. It is varied terrain, with areas of sandy sediment, rocky outcrops, and the kind of irregular bottom topography that makes interpreting sonar data difficult even for experienced operators. A wreck sitting on a seabed like that can look very different from what you might expect, especially after more than 100 years of sediment accumulation and marine growth. The most sustained and serious modern effort to find the Waratah was led by Emlyn Brown, a South African researcher who became, over many years, Probably the most dedicated investigator the case has ever had, Brown was not a professional maritime archaeologist or a naval historian by formal training. He was someone who became genuinely absorbed by the mystery and spent decades accumulating evidence, studying the records, and eventually organising actual search expeditions. His commitment to the case is the kind of thing that is easy to find slightly eccentric from a distance, and genuinely admirable up close, because the research he did was careful and serious, even when the conclusions remained elusive. Brown conducted sonar search expeditions along the Wild Coast in 1999 and again in 2001. These were not small operations. The expeditions used side-scan sonar equipment towed behind search vessels, sweeping the seabed systematically across areas that Brown had identified as the most probable location of the wreck based on his analysis of the last sighting reports, the weather records, and the drift patterns of the Agulhas Current. The methodology was sound. The equipment was appropriate for the task, and the results were genuinely interesting if ultimately frustrating. Over the course of those expeditions, Brown's team identified a number of anomalies on the seabed, targets that the sonar data suggested were man-made objects rather than geological features. The seabed in that region has its own natural formations, but a steel ship of 9,000 tons sitting on the bottom produces a sonar return that looks distinctly different from a rock formation. Brown's team found several targets worth investigating further, and the work of narrowing them down and examining them up close became the next phase of the search. The total area covered by Brown's sonar sweeps across both expeditions was approximately 2,200 square kilometres. That is a substantial area of seabed, larger than some small countries, or at least larger than it sounds when you say it as a number. Sweeping it systematically with side-scan sonar is slow, methodical work, the kind that requires patience and careful data analysis after each pass. The fact that Brown and his team completed it is itself a significant achievement, regardless of what they ultimately found. The water depth across the main search area ranges from roughly 100 to 200 metres. That is not the deepest water in the world. It is well within the operational range of remotely operated vehicles, but it is deep enough that any kind of diving operation using conventional scuba equipment is out of the question. Working at those depths requires specialised ROV technology, and in the late 1990s and early 2000s, deploying that technology from a vessel working in the rough conditions of the Wild Coast was a significant logistical and financial challenge. The currents at depth in that area are strong enough to make ROV control difficult, and the limited visibility on parts of the seabed means that, even when you get a vehicle down to a target, identifying what you are looking at can take time. In 2004, one of the sonar targets that Brown's expeditions had identified was investigated using a remotely operated vehicle. The expectation, or at least the hope, was that the cameras would reveal the outline of a large passenger cargo liner, perhaps partially buried in sediment, perhaps with enough structural features remaining to confirm her identity. The ROV went down, the cameras rolled, and what they found was a wreck, but not the right one. The target turned out to be a different vessel entirely, not the Waratah, but another ship that had gone down in the same general area at some other point in history. The Wild Coast has claimed many ships over the centuries. The Agulhas Current and the rocky coastline have made this stretch of water consistently dangerous, and the seabed beneath it holds the remains of more than one vessel. Finding the wrong wreck is, in its own way, a reminder of how busy and how deadly these waters have been. That particular investigation was disappointing, but it was not the end of the search. Brown continued working on the case. Other researchers have picked up threads of the investigation over the years. The question of where exactly the Waratah lies, whether in the main search corridor along the Wild Coast, or somewhere further offshore, or in a location that no one has yet systematically examined, remains open. One of the complications in any search for the Waratah is the uncertainty about her exact position when she went down. The last confirmed sighting placed her near the Bashi River mouth on the morning of July 27, 1909. But after that sighting, she could have travelled a considerable distance before whatever happened. At 15 knots, her service speed, the Waratah could cover 15 nautical miles in an hour. If she was still making good speed when the crisis occurred, and if it occurred hours after the Clan McIntyre's sighting, she could have been significantly further along the coast or further offshore than the initial search area assumed. This uncertainty about her final position means that any search has to cover a large area, because the target could be anywhere within a zone that stretches along a significant length of coastline and extends an uncertain distance out to sea. There is also the question of what the wreck looks like now, more than 100 years after she went down. Steel hulls in cold, relatively deep water can survive a very long time. The Titanic, which sank in 1912, was found in 1985 and was still recognisable as a ship, though she had broken apart during the sinking and the two sections had settled separately on the bottom. The Waratah, if she capsized rapidly, may have gone down largely intact, or she may have broken apart either during the capsize or on impact with the seabed. If she's sitting in a relatively intact condition, she should produce a clear sonar return and be recognisable when viewed by an ROV camera. If she broke apart significantly, her remains might be more spread out and harder to identify definitively. Sediment is another factor. 115 years is a long time for sediment to accumulate around and over a wreck. In some parts of the Wild Coast search area, the seabed is sandy and current-swept, which might mean relatively little sediment coverage. In other areas, the conditions favour accumulation, and a wreck could be partially or significantly buried. A ship that is heavily buried in sediment will produce a weaker and less clear sonar return, and identifying it from ROV footage becomes more difficult because the distinctive features, the hull shape, the superstructure, the funnels, may be obscured or gone entirely. None of this makes finding the Waratah impossible. It makes it difficult, time-consuming and expensive. Those three qualities have been the consistent obstacles to the search ever since the technology to conduct a meaningful underwater search became available. The equipment exists, the methodology is understood. The general search area, while large, is not impossibly large by the standards of modern deep-sea search operations. What has been missing consistently is the combination of sustained funding and organised effort that a search of this scale requires. There have been occasional discussions over the years about mounting a new, better-equipped search using modern multi-beam sonar and autonomous underwater vehicles, the kind of technology that has transformed deep-sea search operations since the 1990s. Multi-beam sonar, unlike the side-scan sonar used in earlier searches, creates a much more detailed three-dimensional picture of the seabed and can cover a wider swath in a single pass. Autonomous underwater vehicles can operate at depth for extended periods without the tether limitations of ROVs, and they can be programmed to run systematic search patterns with a precision that was not possible in earlier decades. The combination of these tools, applied to the Waratah search area with modern positioning technology and up-to-date analysis of the Agulhas current's behaviour, would represent a significantly more capable search effort than anything that has been attempted so far. Whether that search will happen is a different question. Maritime archaeology is not a well-funded field, and the Waratah, while historically significant, does not carry the name recognition that drives the large-scale commercial interest that funded, for example, the search for the Titanic. She is remembered in Australia and South Africa, and among people who follow maritime history seriously, but she is not a household name in the way that some other lost ships are. That relative obscurity has probably contributed to the difficulty of assembling the resources needed for a definitive modern search. What Brown's work demonstrated, though, is that the search is not futile. The anomalies his expeditions identified on the seabed showed that there are targets in the search area that warrant closer examination, and the fact that one of them turned out to be a different wreck does not mean the others have been fully investigated. The The seabed along the wild coast holds its secrets carefully, but it is not impenetrable. The Waratah is almost certainly down there somewhere. The alternative, that a 9,000-ton steel ship somehow left no trace on the seabed any more than it left a trace on the surface, is extremely difficult to accept. Steel does not dissolve. Hulls do not simply cease to exist. Whatever happened to the Waratah on the morning of July 27th, 1909, she went somewhere, and that somewhere is most likely a patch of seabed between 100 and 200 metres below the surface of the Indian Ocean, somewhere along or near the wild coast of South Africa. The searchers have not found her yet. That is the honest answer. After more than a century of effort, ranging from the ships that combed the coastline in 1909 to the sonar expeditions of the late 1990s and early 2000s, the Waratah remains unlocated. But unlocated is not the same as unfindable. And the people who have spent time on this case, Brown most notably, but others as well, have generally maintained that the wreck is there, that it can be found, and that finding it would change what we know about the disappearance in ways that no amount of historical analysis or theoretical modelling can match. Because the wreck is not just an artefact, it is evidence. The condition of the hull could tell investigators whether she broke apart in a capsize or whether something else caused catastrophic structural failure. Signs of fire damage, if present, would support the fire theory in a way that the historical record alone cannot. The distribution of the wreck across the seabed, whether she is in one piece or scattered, would give information about the nature of the sinking. The cargo, still in the holds after all this time, would confirm the loading details that were disputed at the inquiry. A confirmed identification of the wreck would, for the first time, give the Waratah story an ending that is based on physical evidence rather than probability and inference. That is what the searchers have been reaching for across all those decades and all those expeditions. Not just the satisfaction of solving a historical puzzle, though that matters too, but the possibility of finally giving those 211 people a confirmed place in the world, a location that can be marked on a chart and visited in memory, even if not in person. The search continues, in the sense that the question remains open, the technology continues to improve, and the wreck continues to wait on the seabed of the wild coast, as it has been waiting for 115 years. And behind all of that searching, behind the sonar data and the ROV footage, and the carefully analysed anomalies, there are the people who were aboard, the passengers, the crew, the captain, whose story has never quite been fully told, because the ending has never quite been confirmed. And behind all of that searching, behind the sonar data and the ROV footage and the carefully analysed anomalies, there are the people who were aboard, the passengers, the crew, the captain, whose story has never quite been fully told, because the ending has never quite been confirmed. There were 211 of them. That number appears in almost every account of the Waratah, stated plainly, and then usually left there, as if the number itself is sufficient. But 211 is not an abstraction. It is a count of individual people, people who had boarded a ship in Durban on the morning of July 26th, 1909, with tickets, with luggage, with plans for what they would do when they reached Cape Town. Some of them had been travelling for weeks already, coming from Australia on the long ocean passage through the Indian Ocean. Some had joined the ship at Durban after shorter journeys. All of them had, in one way or another, decided to be on that ship, on that particular sailing, on that particular day. And none of them arrived. The passenger manifest has been partially reconstructed from records, though not completely. The Waratah was carrying 92 passengers on her final voyage, along with a crew of 119. The passengers were a reasonably mixed group, as was typical for a liner running the Australia-South Africa-United Kingdom route. There were families, some of them relocating, some returning home after time abroad. There were businessmen. There were travellers making the passage for reasons that were not always recorded. Some accounts mentioned passengers who were South African, others who were British, and a number who had been living in Australia and were heading back to England. The ship was not full to capacity. She could carry more passengers than she had aboard on this voyage, which in some ways makes the loss feel even more specific. These were not crowds, but a particular group of people who happened to be travelling together at that moment. One of the passengers often mentioned in accounts of the Waratah was a Mr. and Mrs. Ebsworth, an elderly couple travelling together. There were children aboard as well, though the exact number is difficult to confirm from surviving records. The loss of families, parents and children together, was something that weighed heavily on those who followed the story in the weeks and months after the ship failed to arrive. It was not simply that people had died, as terrible as that was. It was that entire family units had disappeared simultaneously, leaving no one behind to carry the immediate grief, and leaving relatives in England and Australia and South Africa waiting for news that never came. The crew of 119 were, for the most part, British merchant seamen. They had their own lives, their own families in port towns and coastal cities, their own routines of shipping out and returning. Merchant seafaring in 1909 was not a particularly glamorous profession. It was steady work, often hard work, and the men who did it were generally practical, experienced, and not given to unnecessary drama about the dangers involved. The sea was dangerous. Everyone in the trade knew that. But ships crossed these routes constantly, and most voyages ended without incident. The crew of the Waratah had every reason to expect that this voyage would end the same way the previous ones had. At the head of all of them was Captain Josiah Ilbery. He's worth pausing on for a moment, because he tends to appear in accounts of the Waratah as a name attached to a title, and not much more than that. But Ilbery was not a young or inexperienced commander. He had been with the Blue Anchor Line for a significant number of years by the time he took command of the Waratah, and he was regarded within the company and within maritime circles as one of their most capable and reliable officers. He knew the South African route. He had commanded ships through these waters before. He was by every account available exactly the kind of experienced, steady commander you would want on a ship running a long ocean passage. There is something quietly troubling about that. Ilbery's experience did not save him, or the ship, or anyone aboard. Whatever happened off the wild coast on the morning of July 27th happened fast enough, and completely enough, that a seasoned captain with years of experience in these waters could not prevent it, could not send a distress signal, could not deploy lifeboats in any way that left evidence behind. That is not a criticism of Ilbery. It is a reflection of how sudden and total the event must have been. If a rogue wave struck the ship and capsized her in minutes, or even seconds, the most experienced captain in the world would have had no meaningful opportunity to respond. The sea, when it moves like that, does not offer a window for decision-making. What Ilbery's family went through in the weeks after the ship failed to arrive is not well documented, but it is not hard to imagine the shape of it. First, the uncertainty. Ships were sometimes delayed. Communications were imperfect. Perhaps there was a mechanical problem and she had put into an unscheduled port. Then the growing alarm as the search produced nothing. Then the long, grinding absence of any definitive answer. No body, no wreck, no confirmed account of what had happened. Just the knowledge that the ship had been seen, and then had not been seen, and that somewhere in between those two moments, 211 people had ceased to exist in the world. The families of the crew and passengers faced a particular kind of grief that is different from the grief that follows a confirmed death. When a ship sinks and wreckage is found and bodies are recovered, however painful that process is, it provides a definitive point. There is a date. There is a place. There is, in the most basic sense, an ending that can be acknowledged and mourned. The Waratah did not provide that. She provided instead an open question, a disappearance rather than a death, at least legally and emotionally for a long time afterward. This created practical difficulties as well as emotional ones. Probate cases, the legal processes by which the estates of the deceased are settled, require a confirmed death. In the case of the Waratah's passengers and crew, There was no confirmed death in the immediate aftermath of the disappearance. There was a missing ship and a missing crew and missing passengers, and the legal machinery of the time was not well equipped to handle that kind of ambiguity efficiently. Cases dragged on for years in some instances, as courts and families and insurers worked through the question of how to handle estates when there was no body, no wreck, no date of death that could be established with certainty. The inquiry of 1910 helped establish a probable timeline, but it did not provide the kind of definitive legal resolution that would have allowed these cases to close quickly and cleanly. For the families left behind, this prolonged uncertainty was its own particular cruelty. Grief is hard enough when it has a clear object. When the object is uncertain, when you're not entirely sure whether to mourn or to wait, whether to begin the process of settling an estate, or to hold on a little longer in case some news comes, it becomes something more complicated and more exhausting. There are accounts from the period of families in England and Australia who waited for months, holding on to the faint possibility that some survivors had reached land somewhere along the wild coast, that some small group had made it to shore and had not yet been found. The wild coast was remote. Communications were imperfect. It was not entirely impossible in the early weeks to imagine that survivors existed somewhere who had simply not yet been located. But the weeks passed, and the searches continued, and no survivors appeared. And gradually the possibility shrank and then disappeared entirely, and what remained was the loss without the confirmation, the absence without the explanation. Claude Sawyer, the man who had left the ship at Durban the day before she sailed for the last time, found himself in a strange position in the aftermath of the disappearance. He had made a decision that, in retrospect, had saved his life. He had testified at the inquiry about his premonitions and his fears, and his account had become one of the most discussed elements of the Waratah story in the press coverage of the time. But Sawyer himself does not appear to have treated his escape from the ship as a matter of triumph or vindication. The accounts of his testimony suggest a man who was genuinely distressed by what had happened, and who found no particular comfort in having been right about his fears. He had left the ship. 211 people had not. That is a difficult thing to carry, whatever the circumstances of the decision. His recurring visions of a figure holding a bloody sword, which he described at the inquiry in careful, somewhat embarrassed detail, have become the most frequently repeated element of his story, partly because they are strange and memorable, and partly because they seem to suggest something that the rational framework of the inquiry could not quite accommodate. Sawyer himself did not claim to be psychic or to have received a supernatural warning. He described the visions as troubling and as contributing to his general unease about the ship, alongside more practical concerns about her behaviour in the water. The inquiry treated his testimony seriously, in the sense that they recorded it carefully and questioned him about it, but they did not draw any conclusions from it beyond noting that he had chosen to leave the ship, based on a combination of rational concern and personal unease. What the Sawyer story illustrates, more than anything supernatural, is how the Waratah's disappearance has always existed in two registers simultaneously. There is the technical register, the metacentric height, the cargo loading, the Agulhas current, the rogue wave theory. And then there is the human register, which includes Sawyer's visions and the families who waited, and Captain Ilbury's experience, and the ordinary people who simply got on a ship and did not get off. Both of these registers are real. Both of them matter. The technical questions are important because they might eventually tell us what happened. The human questions matter because they remind us why it matters that we find out. 211 people. The number keeps returning. It is not as large as some maritime disasters. The Titanic carried more than 2,000 and lost more than 1,500. The Waratah's loss, in terms of sheer numbers, is not among the largest in maritime history. But the completeness of the disappearance gives it a weight that is not simply proportional to the number of lives lost. Every one of those 211 people vanished without a confirmed trace. No body was ever definitively identified as coming from the Waratah. No lifeboat was ever confirmed as hers. No piece of cargo was ever definitively matched to her manifest. They are simply gone, in a way that very few groups of people in the modern era have been simply gone. There is a memorial to the Waratah in South Africa, and the ship is remembered in Australian maritime history, but the memorials feel somewhat tentative, as if the communities that built them were not entirely sure what they were memorialising, because the loss was never fully confirmed in the way that other maritime disasters were confirmed. You can visit the site where the Titanic sank. You can stand at the coordinates and know that the wreck is below you, that the people who died are in a specific place. With the Waratah, you cannot do that. You can stand on the wild coast and look out at the Indian Ocean and know that somewhere out there, probably not too far from where you're standing, something happened to a ship and 211 people. But you cannot point to a spot on the water and say, there, it happened there. The absence of a confirmed place is part of what makes the Waratah's story feel unfinished in a way that most maritime disasters, however terrible, do not. The wreck, when it is eventually found, if it is eventually found, will not bring those people back. Nothing will do that. But it will give the loss a location, a physical reality, an ending that can be placed on a chart and acknowledged. It will transform the disappearance, at least in some small way, from an open question into a confirmed fact. And for the descendants of the people who were aboard, some of whom are still alive, still aware of this piece of their family history, that confirmation would mean something real. The 211 people who sailed from Durban on July 26, 1909, deserved better than the silence that followed them. They deserved answers. They deserved, at the very minimum, to be found. And the fact that they have not been found yet is not a failure of caring exactly. People have searched. People have spent decades on this case. But it is an unfinished obligation, the kind that sits quietly at the edge of maritime history and does not go away simply because 115 years have passed. The question of what happened to them is also, in a very direct sense, the question of what happened to the ship. And that question brings us back to where the technology and the history and the human story all converge, to what a discovery of the Waratah would actually mean, and what it might finally be able to tell us. The technology that exists today for searching the deep ocean floor is, when you think about it, genuinely remarkable compared to what was available even 30 years ago. In 1909, when the search for the Waratah was conducted, the tools available were essentially a ship, a pair of eyes, and the hope that something would be floating on the surface. There was no aerial reconnaissance. There was no sonar of any kind. There was no way to look beneath the water. The search vessels could only observe what the sea chose to show them, and the sea chose to show them nothing. Even by the time Emlyn Brown was conducting his expeditions in 1999 and 2001, the technology, while vastly improved, was still limited enough that a wreck could sit on the seabed and be difficult to distinguish from natural features without a great deal of careful work. What we have now is different in kind, not just in degree. Modern multi-beam sonar systems can map the seabed in extraordinary detail, producing three-dimensional images of the ocean floor that would have seemed like science fiction to the naval architects who testified at the 1910 inquiry. Where older sonar systems sent a single beam downward and received a single return, multi-beam systems send out dozens or hundreds of beams simultaneously, sweeping a wide swath of seabed with each pass of a survey vessel. The result is a detailed bathymetric map, a topographic map of the ocean floor that can resolve features just a few meters across. A ship the size of the Waratah, 465 feet long and sitting on a relatively flat seabed, would appear on a modern multi-beam survey as a clearly anomalous shape. You would not mistake it for a rock formation or a sand dune. The hull would stand out. Alongside multi-beam sonar, autonomous underwater vehicles, AUVs, have changed what is possible in deep water search operations. These are essentially robotic submarines that can be pre-programmed with a search pattern, dropped into the water, and left to work independently for many hours, scanning the seabed with high-resolution sonar or cameras at depths and in conditions that would make crude submersible operations extremely difficult. The AUVs used in modern maritime archaeology can operate in currents that would have defeated the remotely operated vehicles used in earlier Waratah search attempts. They are quieter, more manoeuvrable, and capable of getting much closer to the seabed than a towed sonar array. If the Waratah is sitting in the search area at a depth of, say, 150 metres, a modern AUV survey could locate it with a degree of confidence that simply was not achievable in 2004 when the last serious investigation of a sonar target was conducted. Satellite-aided positioning is another piece of the puzzle that matters more than it might seem. One of the difficulties with the earlier search expeditions was knowing, with precision, exactly where you had already searched and where you had not. In 1999 and 2001, GPS positioning was available, but not as refined as it is today, and keeping a survey vessel on a precise track in the conditions of the wild coast, with the Agulhas current pushing the ship laterally and swells making station-keeping difficult, meant that search lanes could overlap in some places and leave gaps in others. Modern positioning systems, combined with better dynamic positioning on survey vessels, allow for much more systematic coverage. You can be confident at the end of a survey that you have actually looked at every square kilometre you intended to look at. The Agulhas current itself, which has been one of the defining features of this whole story, is now understood in considerably more detail than it was even 20 years ago. Oceanographers have mapped its behaviour extensively, including the way it meanders and occasionally sheds large eddies that spin off into the South Atlantic. Satellite altimetry, measuring the slight surface elevation of the ocean caused by strong currents, can track the current's position and behaviour in near real time. This matters for a search operation because the current affects where any debris from a sinking ship would have travelled, and it also affects where the ship itself might have drifted in the hours or minutes between whatever happened and the moment she went under. If the Waratah was disabled by a rogue wave, a structural failure, a fire, before she sank, the current could have carried her some distance from the last confirmed sighting near the Bashi River mouth. A better understanding of the current's behaviour allows searchers to model that drift more accurately and refine the search area. There is also the question of what the wreck itself would look like after 115 years on the seabed. This is worth thinking about carefully because the condition of the wreck would directly affect what a discovery could tell us. Steel hulls in cold, deep, low-oxygen water can survive remarkably well over long periods. The Titanic, found in 1985 at a depth of roughly 3,800 metres in the North Atlantic, was recognisable as a ship despite 73 years on the seabed, though biological and chemical processes have degraded much of the hull since then. The Waratah, if she lies at a depth of 100 to 200 metres off the wild coast, would be in shallower and warmer water than the Titanic, which would likely mean more biological activity and somewhat faster degradation of organic materials. But the steel hull itself, the main structure of the ship, would almost certainly still be present and identifiable. At those depths, the pressure is not extreme, and the cold water chemistry of the deep seabed tends to preserve metal structures reasonably well. What a confirmed discovery of the Waratah would mean, in practical terms, goes well beyond simply locating a wreck on a chart. The condition of the hull could speak directly to the questions that the 1910 inquiry could not answer. If the ship capsized due to instability, the most likely conclusion of the inquiry, she would probably be found lying on her side or upside down, and the hull itself might show relatively little catastrophic structural damage, since capsizing is a hydrodynamic failure rather than a structural one. If, on the other hand, she suffered a structural failure, a hull fracture of the kind that has claimed other ships, there might be evidence of that in how the wreck is broken and distributed across the seabed. A fire would leave its own traces, heat damage to the hull plating, evidence of burning in specific compartments. These things can be read from a wreck, even after more than a century if the investigation is conducted carefully. The stability debate, which has been running since the first complaints were made during the maiden voyage in 1908, could potentially be resolved by examining how the cargo was actually distributed in the holds. Cargo manifests tell you what was loaded, but they do not always tell you exactly where it was stowed. The physical evidence of the wreck, what is in which hold, how it settled, could give naval architects a much clearer picture of the ship's actual centre of gravity on her final voyage. This would not be a simple analysis, but it is the kind of work that maritime archaeologists and engineers have done on other wrecks, and the Waratah would be an important enough find to justify a serious effort. It is worth comparing the Waratah's situation briefly to other wrecks that have been found after long periods of uncertainty. The Titanic is the obvious comparison. Found in 1985, 73 years after sinking, by a joint American and French expedition led by Robert Ballard, using deep-towed sonar and a remotely operated vehicle. The discovery transformed the understanding of how the ship sank, revealing that the hull had broken in two before the final plunge, which settled a long-running debate among survivors and investigators. The Hood, the British battlecruiser sunk by the Bismarck in 1941 with the loss of all but 3 of her 1,418 crew, was found in 2001 at a depth of around 2,800 metres in the North Atlantic. The wreck confirmed details of the explosion that destroyed her. Even the more recent discovery of the San Jose, a Spanish galleon sunk in 1708 off the coast of Colombia, showed that wrecks can be found and identified after centuries on the seabed. The Waratah has been missing for 115 years, a long time, but not an exceptional time in the context of maritime archaeology. The Montevideo Maru is a case that sits in interesting contrast to the Waratah. An Australian prisoner of war transport torpedoed by an American submarine in 1942, carrying more than 1,000 Australian prisoners and civilian internees, the Montevideo Maru has still not been found, despite being one of the worst maritime disasters in Australian history. Its absence from the confirmed found list is a reminder that finding wrecks, even with modern technology, is genuinely difficult, and that the ocean is large and the seabed is complex. But the Montevideo Maru sank in deep water in the South China Sea, an area with significant logistical challenges for search operations. The Waratah's likely resting place, in comparatively shallow water within a defined stretch of the South African coast, is a more tractable problem. The will and the funding, as has been noted, are the remaining obstacles. Maritime search expeditions are expensive. A serious AUV survey of the kind that would give a high probability of locating the Waratah, covering the full search area with modern equipment, with the vessel support and technical expertise required, would cost several $1 million at minimum. That is not an extraordinary sum in the context of deep-sea research, but it requires someone to commit to it. A government agency, a research institution, a documentary production, a private benefactor with an interest in maritime history. The South African government has periodically expressed interest in the Waratah case, and the ship has enough cultural resonance in both South Africa and Australia that there is a real constituency for finding her. Whether that interest ever translates into a funded, properly equipped search expedition remains to be seen. There is also the legal dimension of a potential discovery, which is easy to overlook but genuinely significant. The Waratah was a registered vessel of the Blue Anchor Line, which ceased to exist within a year of her loss. The question of who owns the wreck, and the legal framework under which any investigation or recovery would be conducted, is not entirely straightforward. Under the UNESCO Convention on the Protection of the Underwater Cultural Heritage, wrecks more than 100 years old are entitled to specific protections, and any investigation would need to be conducted in accordance with those standards. The Waratah would qualify as a protected site under this framework, which means that any discovery would come with significant responsibilities regarding how the wreck is treated and what, if anything, is recovered from it. The families of those aboard, or rather the descendants of those families, now several generations removed, would have a legitimate interest in how a discovered wreck is handled. The 211 people who sailed from Durban on July 26, 1909, are not simply historical abstractions. They have descendants who are alive today, some of whom are aware of their connection to the Waratah and have followed the story of the search over the years. A discovery would be significant for them in ways that go beyond the historical and technical. It would be, among other things, a confirmation that something real happened to real people in a real place, which sounds obvious, but which the complete absence of physical evidence has, in a strange way, made harder to fully accept over the decades. The wild coast itself has not changed much in the century, and more since the Waratah disappeared. It remains one of the more remote stretches of coastline in South Africa, rugged, sparsely populated, without the major ports or developed infrastructure that characterize other parts of the South African coast. The Agulhas current still runs close to shore, still generates the kind of conditions that make this one of the more challenging stretches of water in the southern hemisphere. Ships still navigate this coast with care. The sea still keeps its own counsel about what lies beneath it, and beneath it, somewhere in that stretch of water between the Bashi River mouth and Cape Town, almost certainly lies the Waratah. The probability that she drifted far beyond the search area before sinking is low. Ships that capsize or suffer catastrophic structural failure do not typically travel enormous distances before going under. The probability that she was found and identified without anyone realizing it is essentially zero. A ship of her size and construction would be unmistakable if properly examined. She's most likely where the logic of her last known position and the physics of the current suggest she should be, somewhere in those 100 to 200 meters of water along the wild coast, her steel hull resting on the seabed, largely intact, keeping the answers that the 1910 inquiry could not find. What those answers are, whether they confirm the capsizing theory, reveal evidence of a rogue wave strike, show signs of fire or structural failure, or something else entirely, we do not yet know. That uncertainty is the condition under which the Waratah has existed for 115 years, and it is the condition that a future expedition could finally change. The technology is there, the location is approximately known, the story is one of the most compelling in Southern Hemisphere maritime history. All of that brings us finally to the question of what the Waratah's disappearance means not just as a technical puzzle or a historical event, but as something larger. Something about the sea and silence and the particular weight of things that vanish without explanation. There is something particular about a disappearance that leaves nothing behind. Most disasters, even the terrible ones, leave evidence. They leave wreckage, and wreckage tells a story. The Titanic left lifeboats and bodies and a debris field that stretched for miles. The inquiry that followed had photographs, survivors, physical testimony, wreckage recovered from the surface. The story of what happened could be reconstructed, argued over, refined across the decades, because there was something to argue about. The Waratah left none of that. She left a last sighting, a calm morning, a ship that appeared normal to the officers watching from the Clan McIntyre, and then nothing at all. That particular kind of silence is different from the silence that follows a known catastrophe. It is heavier, somehow, less resolved. What makes the Waratah linger in the imagination is not the scale of the loss. 211 people is a terrible number, but maritime history contains disasters of far greater magnitude. It is not the drama of the final moments, because no one knows what those moments were. It is not even the unanswered technical questions, though those are genuinely interesting. What makes the Waratah stay with you is the completeness of the silence. She was a real ship built by real hands in Glasgow, sailed by experienced officers on a known route, seen by witnesses on an ordinary winter morning off the South African coast, and then she was simply not there anymore. No distress signal, no wreckage, no bodies, no explanation that has ever been confirmed. That is an unusual thing, even in the long and often tragic history of the sea. Claude Sawyer testified at the inquiry in 1910 with what must have been a complicated mixture of relief and grief. He had left the ship at Durban because he was afraid. He had told people he was afraid. He had sent a telegram to his wife, and then the ship had vanished and he was alive and 211 other people were not. His recurring visions of the figure with the bloody sword are easy to read as premonition, and many accounts of the Waratah story do read them that way, with a certain dramatic relish. But it is worth sitting with the more human version of Sawyer's experience. He was a passenger who had noticed something that made him uncomfortable about the way the ship moved. He had probably heard other passengers talking. He had made a decision to leave which would have felt embarrassing and possibly irrational at the time, and which was then confirmed in the most terrible way possible. What he felt afterward, the guilt, the strangeness of being the one who got off, is not something the inquiry records capture, because inquiries are not designed to capture that kind of thing. Captain Josiah Ilbery had been at sea for a long time. He knew the wild coast. He knew the Agulhas current. He had made this run before, understood what winter conditions in these waters could produce. He was not a careless man or an inexperienced one. Whatever happened to the Waratah happened to a ship under the command of someone who knew what he was doing, and that matters. It means the event was not simply a product of negligence or ignorance. It was something that overwhelmed competence and experience, which is the kind of thing the sea occasionally does regardless of how well prepared you are. The 211 people aboard were not, in the main, people who expected to be part of a historical mystery. They were passengers going home, or going to work, or travelling for reasons that seemed ordinary at the time. They were crew members doing a job on a ship they had signed onto. The families who waited in Cape Town, and in England, and in Australia, waited first with concern and then with something harder to name. The particular anguish of not knowing, which is different from grief, and in some ways more difficult to carry. Grief has a shape. Not knowing does not. The probate cases that dragged on for years afterward were a legal expression of that unresolved state. The law, like the families, could not fully process a loss that had no confirmed date, no confirmed place, no body, no wreck. The wild coast today is much as it was in July 1909. That is not a sentimental observation, but a practical one. The coastline between the Bashi River mouth and the eastern approaches to Cape Town remains one of the less developed stretches of the South African shore. The cliffs are still there. The surf still runs hard against the rocks. The Agulhas current still moves southwestward close to shore, still generates the conditions that have made this stretch of water dangerous for as long as ships have sailed it. Winter storms still push heavy swells around the cape and into the current. The sea here does not feel like a background, it feels like a presence. Somewhere beneath that presence, almost certainly, is the Waratah. Not as a metaphor, as a physical object, 9,000 tons of steel, her hull resting on the seabed somewhere in water that is probably between 100 and 200 metres deep, in a stretch of coast that has been searched but not exhaustively, not with the tools that now exist. The steel of a ship's hull, in cold, deep water with limited biological activity, can survive remarkably well over a century. The Titanic, found in 1985, was recognisable despite the depth and the decades. The Hood, found in 2001, was identifiable despite the violence of her end. The Waratah, if she's where the evidence suggests she is, would not have been subjected to the same pressures as a ship in the deep Atlantic. She would be damaged, certainly, altered by time and current and the slow processes of the sea. But she would be there, and she would be the Waratah, and the answers she carries about what happened on the morning of July 27th or 28th, 1909, about whether the stability concerns were justified, about how fast she went down and why no one got a signal out. Those answers would still be readable in the physical evidence of the wreck. That is what a discovery would mean, not just the closing of a historical file, though it would be that. Not just the resolution of a technical debate about metacentric height and cargo distribution, though it would be that too. It would mean that the silence finally ended, that the sea gave something back, that the 211 people aboard the Waratah had, at last, a confirmed place where they were lost, which is a small thing and also not a small thing at all. For now, though, the silence continues. The inquiry of 1910 reached its probable conclusions and closed without certainty. The searches of the late 20th and early 21st centuries found anomalies on the seabed that turned out to be other vessels, other stories. The Waratah remains in that unusual category of things that are known to have existed, known to have been lost, and yet not confirmed in the physical world in the way that most lost things eventually are. She is documented. She is historical. She is, in some sense, still missing. There is a particular kind of patience required to sit with that. The families who waited in 1909 had to find that patience without choosing it. The researchers who have spent decades on the case have chosen it, and it says something about the hold the Waratah has on the imagination that people have continued to look, continue to care, continue to find the question worth asking across more than a century. Emlyn Brown, who spent a significant part of his life on this search, is perhaps the clearest example of that commitment. The kind of sustained attention that a mystery like this one seems to generate in certain people. The sense that the answer is there and that it matters to find it. It does matter. Not in the way that cures for diseases matter, or in the way that large geopolitical questions matter, but in the quieter way that history matters, and that human loss matters, and that the sea's capacity to keep secrets matters. The Waratah is one of the Southern Hemisphere's most enduring maritime mysteries, not because it is the largest or the most dramatic, but because it is the most complete. The silence around it is total in a way that very few maritime disasters achieve, and that silence, after 115 years, still carries weight. If you have stayed with this story from the beginning, through the Glasgow shipyard and the maiden voyage and Claude Sawyer's nightmares and the Clan MacIntyre's last sighting, and the long, fruitless search and the inconclusive inquiry, then you have spent some time in that silence yourself. You have sat with a question that does not have an answer yet. That is not a comfortable place exactly, but it is an honest one. The Waratah disappeared. We do not know why. We do not know where, precisely. We do not know what the final minutes aboard were like, or whether there was any warning, or whether the sea took her so quickly that there was no time for anything at all. What we know is that she was there, off the wild coast, on a winter morning in 1909. The officers of the Clan MacIntyre watched her. She looked normal. And then the sea closed over whatever happened next, and has not opened since. The Agulhas current is still running tonight, close to that rugged shore. The swells are still coming around the cape, somewhere down in the dark and the cold, in water that is quieter than the surface above it. There is very likely a ship that has been waiting a long time to be found. Whether she's found in our lifetime or not, she is there. The sea keeps its secrets carefully, but it does not destroy them. It only holds them in the deep and the dark until someone comes looking with the right tools and enough patience and the will to finally ask the question in a way the seabed can answer. Thank you for spending this time with the Waratah, and with the people who sailed on her, and with the long, strange silence that followed. If this kind of story is what you come here for, the careful ones, the unhurried ones, the ones that sit with uncertainty rather than pretending it away, then this channel is for you, and it would mean a great deal if you subscribed, or left a like, or simply came back next time. These stories take a long time to tell properly. It is good to know someone is listening.